South, the Pinewood High School Incident. Chapter 6. When I think of feeding my family, I can think of no other brand than Southern Cuts. From their large selection of meats utilizing the best poultry and livestock, as well as alternative meats such as lab-grown solutions which use abundant algae blooms and other renewables. Southern Cuts is a one-stop producer that will feed any crowd, no matter how ravenous. Try our line of oven-ready bakes to shorten dinner prep to less than 15 minutes a meal. Worried about cleanup? Every dinner comes in a throwaway container that goes from the oven to the table to the trash with no fuss. Get yourself down to your nearest grocery store and try Southern Cuts today and gain a new perspective on meat. Southern Cuts, a Cadwell company. Cassidy maintained her focus on the screen of the TV without moving, her attention locked on the intricacies of each pixel that emitted light. She wasn't herself. Rather, there was something within, an entity she felt she had no control over, that wanted to experience everything it felt was new to it. Even the air around her felt foreign, as she seemed to analyze each breath. Another advertisement presented itself, this time for another breakfast cereal she knew she didn't have yet. She wondered if she should try it, the thought seeming to please her passenger with memories of enjoying other cereal brands growing its appetite. As she continued to allow the entity within her to enjoy itself, with the lights and sounds of her reality, a sudden press of the power button forced them both to focus on the enemy in the room. Cassidy. A gentle voice that she thought familiar tried to reach her. "Hey, Cassidy, it's First Lady Martha. Do you remember me?" It was a woman, her brown skin radiating a warmth that seemed like something she had forgotten long ago. Cassidy didn't answer. Rather, she couldn't, due to the entity holding her mouth closed. She didn't like being controlled in that way, but she supposed that there was going to be a good amount of time for them to figure out how to operate her body together. She turned her attention back to the now black TV screen and waited for it to turn back on. Instead of her desire manifesting itself in the automatic return of their entertainment, she was presented with the woman who continued to be a nuisance, standing in front of them with her thinner frame. "Cassidy, we would like to speak with you in the dining room." Martha continued to reach for her. Cassidy felt the creature writhe within her, its irritation at not being satiated, making both of them react by staring the woman down with a hard look. Martha seemed to not catch on and, instead of leaving Cassidy to her devices, extended her hand towards her in a gesture of goodwill. At first, Cassidy ignored the attempt and maintained her gaze on the intruder, but then, perhaps out of curiosity or forwardness, the other one used her hand and met the woman's intent. She was led through the house towards the front, where the dining room was, entering the space where her mother, Arthur, and another person that made her cringe, sat at the rectangle dining table. Cassidy's consciousness was in an odd state, her attention being split between the noise of the gathered members and the constant caressing of her new inhabitant. She knew what they wanted to talk to her about, but she didn't know if she would be able to keep what was in her at bay for that long. It had wanted to lash out at her mom earlier that day, but she managed to avoid anything drastic by distracting it with the TV. As she took her seat in the room She touched the spot where she was possessed. Whatever the entity was could easily overpower her will at any moment. Cassidy, a familiar voice snatched her from the other side of her abyss. The woman that took her from in front of the TV was now sat across from her, something within her shining like a bright beacon and irritating Cassidy's rider. Her mother and Arthur maintained themselves beside Cassidy while speaking to the other guest, beside Martha, that she didn't recognize at first. Beside the bright woman was an even brighter man. The posture he maintained at his seat reminded her of her father. "Cassidy, it's been quite a while since I saw you." The man of God's voice was as she remembered. "You're looking more like your mother than ever." "Why are they here?" Cassidy shot a look at Sandra. "I called them," Arthur said unapologetically. "Ever since we lost Dad, things haven't been right with us. I thought that maybe we could talk and..." Cassidy rolled her eyes. The same feelings that gripped her before with her father seemed to return in that moment. She remembered the conversations they would have, his insistence that she focus her attention on God and let go of trying to fit in at school. He would call them distractions, not fit for her care. A part of her knew that was true, but even with the realization that it was the right way of thinking, she would constantly struggle with the commitment. Of all the things she was asked to accept and work through, her relationship, as they called it, with God was not something she felt she could grasp. "What's there to talk about?" Cassidy narrowed in on Arthur. "I think it's pretty cut and dry, right? Dad's dead. That's the way life is, isn't it?" "That's a part of it, yes," the Reverend chimed in. "Life is fleeting. What we do while we live is share what we know with who's around us in hopes that they continue to teach others. Sister Cassidy, death isn't the end for God's chosen because we continue through the ones we help. By that logic, your father is very much alive, right?" Cassidy folded her arms. The thought of her being lectured yet again by one of God's elect frustrated her. What sense did it make what anyone left behind? In her mind, all that mattered was the moment. Who was there in the moment to help lift the burden of life off of each other's shoulder? When someone was dead, that was the end. Their influence would stick around for a little while, but after the next generation, they would be forgotten. She shifted her attention to her mother, who was focusing her attention on a cup of water on the table and sighed. "Mom," Cassidy began, "did you tell the Reverend how your appointments have been going? The doctors have been saying that she's regressed since the initial accident. Did you tell them how you've been supplementing the meds you were supposed to be taking with a homegrown remedy?" She shifted her attention to Arthur again. "What about you, big bro? Have you told the good Reverend about the swimming pool of alcohol you've been coddling yourself with every night?" "That's enough, Cassidy." Arthur began to frown. "Is it? What are you going to do? Launch yourself at me again like before?" "I said I was sorry about that." He balled his fist. Cassidy felt her heart racing, but she didn't care. Her anger began to stir to the point that she stood from the table. If any of the gathered members of the house were not looking, they were staring with shock then. She wasn't normally that aggressive. She knew that there was something wrong with her, but in the moment, she didn't care. It felt good to get them to notice her for once, to have them understand that she was just as powerful, if not more so, than them. She felt its hands on her shoulder, claw-like and monstrous, feeding her what to say at her accusers. You think that you're better than me, right? Idiots, all of you. Nothing but corpses waiting to be eaten by worms. I see it now, the Reverend said as he stood to meet her gaze. I see what's gripped you, Cassidy, and it's ugly. But we can cast it out. In the name of don't you dare, it spoke for her. Sandra leapt to her feet and backed away from the creature. Arthur also stood, but he positioned himself in front of their mother to protect her. It looked at them as they positioned themselves in formations not familiar to it. The men didn't seem to be nearly as afraid as they should have been, and the other woman was doing that silly muttering with her head bowed. The girl's body wasn't as frail as it had initially thought, but it wasn't as strong as it wanted either. It's exhausting to hear you go on about life and death as though you've experienced both. You want to talk about God, salvation through Jesus? We've treaded that path before, and look where that got us. Here, in a house that has no warmth left, where its inhabitants are trapped in their own versions of hell, doing their best to drown the pain by any means. It was death that brought ruin to this house, and it will be death that will restore its peace. It watched them intently, how they were dancing around in vain to cast it out. It saw the brother whisper something to the mother before she ran up the stairs. It saw how the Reverend, as he was called, was trying to take steps toward it with a silver trinket in his hands. The Martha woman from before held clenched hands to her head, muttering that silly nonsense to her God. It took a step and felt the pull. The girl was trying to regain control despite the immense pain she was subjected to. Please. A faint whisper reached it from within. No. It amused itself by forcing a disgusting smile across her face. As the entity continued to use her body for its amusement, it walked along the length of the dining table towards the front door. By this time, Arthur was positioned in front of it with his arms extended, a stance to indicate that he was not going to let it leave with his sister's body. Within a split second, it had launched itself at him with as much might as it could muster from the girl's body. The meager frame of the girl was surprisingly durable for how different the two combatants were. It managed to struggle against the taller man with equaling strength, something it assumed was the result of something interfering with the girl's natural state. It managed to shove Arthur away from its path, and when it was by the entrance to the dining room, the Reverend grabbed it from behind and placed the trinket on its forehead. By the power of God, we cast you out, demon, Reverend Jacobs commanded. Demon? It raised an eyebrow. Is that what I am? Reverend Jacobs didn't have time to react before the creature freed itself from his grip. By that time, Arthur had regained his footing and approached it, stopping short by a foot. He held out his hands to his side in an attempt to seem innocent of plot, but it knew better. After filing through Cassidy's memories, it knew just how deceptive Arthur could be. It faced him and waited for him to make a move. Let my sister go. Arthur's face was fixed in determination. Didn't you know, brother? It toyed with him. I am your sister. This is what your sister has become. A monster. A freak. This is who I really am. I hurt people and cause mayhem wherever I go. A demon? Yeah, I guess that's right. This entire time, the girl you thought you knew was a demon, hell-bent on destroying lives. Arthur, Cassidy began to break through. Her mind frayed from the constant struggle. Arthur's intense ire eased as he saw his sister for the first time since the conversation began, and took a step closer to her. It was for naught, however, as, when he had approached her, she punched him as hard as she could in the sternum. The impact was not what he had expected, the air in his lungs releasing with enough force to drop him to the floor. Upon doing this, Cassidy stared blankly at her hands, and then to her brother, who was gasping for the air he lost. She looked at Reverend Jacobs, who had cowered back towards where his wife was, and began to cry. Please, she said as her mother appeared behind her. Get it out of me. With a sudden jab, Sandra had injected her with what she was sure to be the sedative the older woman was prescribed by her doctor for her outbursts. It felt cold as it entered her body, a sudden rush of fluid that seemed to cool her overstressed blood vessels. It didn't take long for her to begin feeling the strong medication's effects, and not soon after Sandra had made her way to Arthur's side, Cassidy fell to her knees. Reverend Jacobs, feeling more confident in approaching her, began taking steps toward her. Before she fell into unconsciousness, she could hear them talking, but she couldn't really focus. Something about exercising. That's a dumb thing to talk about right now, she said as she drifted off into sleep. Who would go exercising after all of this? Cassidy awoke a little later in her room, her head spinning from the after effects of the sedative. It was still daylight outside, which she took as an indication that the worst of her encounter with the visiting clergy was yet to be over. She rolled herself out of her bed and sat on the edge, her mind trapped on the previous encounter she had with the family. Maybe it was the medication, or perhaps the cross Reverend Jacobs held to her forehead that had done something, but she didn't feel the demon inside of her anymore. It was as if it had completely disappeared. Just as she was regaining her composure, her door opened to reveal the First Lady. Hello, Cassidy. Martha's lowered voice managed to reach her. Can I come in? Cassidy didn't say anything, not because she didn't want to, but because she didn't know what words she could say that would make the woman go away. She managed to grunt something, but it wasn't enough as, soon after, Martha entered the room and sat adjacent to her. The woman didn't say anything at first. Her attention seemingly focused on the room itself, but after a few seconds of silence, she managed to direct her attention on the distant teen. Cassidy. Please. Cassidy cut her off. I don't want to fight anymore. I'm tired. Leave me alone. Then stop fighting what you know to be true. Martha inched closer to her. That little display you put on downstairs was confirmation enough that you are in need. I get that the last year has been hard on all of you, but you can't do it yourselves, especially you. You're trying to hold this family together on your own, and for what? So that you can get the glory? Cassidy squinted at the conviction. Words that she had heard in sermons past managed to find their way to her as the woman continued to speak. She knew that she was doing her best to keep things from changing, but she was failing. Her thoughts went to her father and how he was willing to do so much for them, even willing to deal with her issues until his final moments. She thought about how Amber had been there for her, despite her arrogance, and the company she had during the last year. All of the aid she had received was given to her without her asking for it, and she felt lost as to why that was. "I didn't ask for it," Cassidy muttered. "I didn't want to be helped." "Why?" Martha leaned in. "Why would you choose to suffer on your own like that, sweetheart? How would that glorify God and produce fruit?" "I felt like..." Cassidy turned and faced Martha, her face red from tears. "I felt like I deserved it." Martha stopped with the pretenses and made her way over to Cassidy to embrace her. Cassidy didn't hold back anymore and gave all of her pain to the woman of God. They remained that way for another few moments until Cassidy was spent, the two ending the session by sitting on the side of the bed that faced the door. Cassidy maintained a gaze on the floor while Martha kept a watchful eye on her, both of them wondering how to continue on with the conversation. Martha was about to say something else, but Cassidy stopped her. "I did something wrong," she began. "I hurt my best friend and joined a witch coven." "Oh." Martha was taken aback. "How did you hurt Amber?" Cassidy explained. "I didn't know what happened, but I felt it. It was like I wasn't in control of myself, like I was being controlled by something. A noise or signal, maybe. You saw it for yourself down there. Every time I get triggered, it's as if I'm a video game character and someone else has the remote." Martha repositioned herself on Cassidy's bed before continuing the conversation. Cassidy assumed that she sounded like her medicine wasn't helping, but what she had done in such a short amount of time was sure to testify against her anyway. Besides, she felt as though she needed to say something. So much was changing in her life so quickly, which was sure to mean that something was wrong somewhere. Could she fix it somehow? What could she do against something that she could not see? What if there was some nefarious force out to get her that had her utter destruction as its main objective? As the storm continued to churn in her mind, something that Martha said pulled her from her chasm. "No, you're wrong," Cassidy snapped. "They have been nothing but supportive of me and what I want. They help me to understand what being a woman really is and..." "Cassidy, you already know what I'm going to say," Martha interjected. "The word speaks against divination and witchcraft for a specific reason. Do you think your effigies and rocks to be greater than God, the one who created everything in existence?" Cassidy tried to choose her words. "I know that my sisters were there for me. Where were you?" Martha raised an eyebrow and nodded a little at the teenager's bold statement. Cassidy felt herself shudder at the thought of challenging an older person and wondered what ridicule she was going to face for being so forward. But it had seemed that Martha was asking for it. The slight pause in their conversation had started to make Cassidy cringe at her words. But before she was allowed to spiral, Martha regained herself and cast a slight grin that confused her. "We've been calling for months, Cassidy." The house was silent as Cassidy and Martha made themselves down the stairs. Cassidy didn't know how she should proceed with the inevitable conversation, but she was sure that the answer lay in confronting the issue head on. As the two re-entered the dining room, they were met with a standing ovation. Excluding Arthur, who was still clutching his chest, Reverend Jacobs and Sandra both approached her to check her vitals. Sandra made Cassidy apologize for striking Arthur, and she did so without looking at him, her face aimed at the hardwood floor. She could sense that he was more upset than he was leading on, and decided to avoid engaging him further. She had made her way over to the seat she was in previously and sat patiently for the others to reconvene. "That's why you have to free yourself by rebuking that demon and turning back to God," the Reverend projected, after a stint of Bible verses. "That talk will have to wait, Reverend," Sandra surprised Cassidy. "Take your time, baby. Do you know who I am?" "I didn't lose my memory, Mom," Cassidy said without enthusiasm. She didn't feel it at first, but when she was asked the question, Cassidy noticed that her face was making a menacing scowl. Upon realizing this, she quickly corrected herself and remained motionless in her chair as the others talked. Martha went on about their talk upstairs, and then asked her brother and mother about their interactions with her previously. The First Lady even chewed out Arthur for his self-destructive nature, something that shocked Cassidy as well. She had thought that she was the only one to be punished for the way that the house was being ruined. However, with Martha's support, the truth was revealed with words she felt she would never have been able to articulate. "I feel as though the issue here is that all three of you have allowed the enemy to infect your lives to some degree," Martha identified. "Look at how violent and inward you've become, Arthur. I know that life is tough, but that doesn't give you the excuse to throw your empathy to the ground. It also doesn't give you the right to throw your weight around, in all sense of the word. Sandra, your kind heart has helped the church in the past in ways that would border zealotry. But that's the issue as well. You've left no space to adapt to the new reality your family faces." "That's right, Sister Sandra," Reverend Jacobs interjected, as if not wanting to be left out of the conversation. "We have to be well-rounded in our approach to life, even as believers. There has to be an understanding that your home and those within have to be taken care of first before you tackle anything else." "But that's not the whole picture, Reverend," Arthur chimed in as well. "We're stuck with the shadow of the past lingering over us. All of the things that we were, our entire identities, have been twisted by that accident. I remember when we would get ready for service on Sundays, how we would pray and then laugh and eat together. I remember how, in service, I would tease Cassidy as she would sit in the choir stand, her chubby face filled with so much enthusiasm." Arthur stopped himself before he could choke on the memories. The room grew silent again as the three victims collected themselves. The Reverend and First Lady took the chance to prepare another scripture, while Cassidy stared off into her mind. She remembered the bits about the choir and Arthur's dumb face as he tried to make her laugh. She remembered the Sunday morning breakfasts and the prayers that helped her forget the troubles at school sometimes. She remembered how her mother would cling to her father every chance that she got, her tight embraces seeming to not bother him in the slightest. As she thought more on the things that were missing, she felt the all too familiar ache in her chest. "I think that we're all in agreement to what the core issue is." The Reverend folded his arms. "We need to return to our first love. We need to fall to our knees and pray to God for forgiveness of our sins. to understand that once we ask for that forgiveness, that we turn away from the foolishness of the world and obey what the word says. I agree. Martha nodded along with her husband's insight. As long as you three continue to ignore God's calling on your lives, the more pain you'll face in the long run. As you were shown in the worst way possible, our lives are fleeting. That doesn't mean that we're to give up and cast our lots with undesirables. We have to accept that death is an inevitable part of our lives and allow the word to guide us through it. Only then will we have an easier time coping with the harshness of sudden loss. For the first time since the accident, Cassidy felt herself agreeing with someone that wasn't Amber or the witch coven. It wasn't that her life was tied to her father in the manner she was thinking. Rather, her life was her own. She had the opportunity to make choices independent of whatever influence anyone tried to impose on her. Even her relationship with God was a choice she was, at one time, sure was a consequence of her father's influence. What did it mean to be a believer in God, the resurrection and rebirth of Jesus? What did that have to do with her relationship with her family and the ones that called her friend? It was enough to cause her head to spin, but she began to feel a sense of acceptance to the aid that the two clergy members were administering. Cassidy began abruptly. I didn't mean to do it, Mom. I didn't mean to cut myself. I was hurting and Dad wouldn't let up. I wanted him to stop trying to fix me like one of his housing projects. It was so easy for him to explain away all the problems of life, my school issues and the Bible lessons. It was all too much for me at that time. I called him while he was at work. I told him that I was going to kill myself. And he tried. He tried to stop me. I wasn't going to do it for real, I think. But he tried to reach me in time. It was my fault, Mom. I'm so sorry. It was my fault. Cassidy felt something move in her. A sudden shift. Like a clawed hand moving itself away from her heart. Sandra leapt up from her seat and rushed to her daughter's side, embracing her with the same tight hug she was sure was given to her dad previously. Sandra was quick to tell her how wrong she was, that what had happened to them was not because of her. She couldn't stop herself from apologizing for not being in the right mindset to help her daughter. She begged for her to forgive her for letting things get to that point and for letting her depression trap her in a stupor. Even Arthur, who was at first watching from his seat, got up and embraced the two women, the three of them finally mourning the loss of the man who held them together. I think that we're about ready for the next part of the plan. Martha smiled at her husband. Yes, he agreed. I think that they're ready to begin healing the way God intended. Reverend Jacobs and his wife stood from their seats and approached the family as they maintained their teary-eyed hold on each other. The Reverend prepared to read the scripture he had prepared while Martha readied herself with the anointing oil. They were ready to exorcise the home and the parishioners of all the negative influences that had gripped their lives up to that point, to pour out their cups filled with the nonsense of blame and doubt in God. The demonic presence that had found its way into their lives was about to be removed, and God's love was going to enter entirely. As the Reverend was about to begin the reading, the doorbell rang. I'll get rid of them. Arthur collected himself and walked towards the door. Cassidy could hear the door open slightly, and a familiar voice echoed into the home. It was Jessica. Her unmistakable influence seduced her eardrums as she confronted Arthur. Cassidy had stopped focusing on the moment she was having with her mother and the others and listened as Jessica continued to try and force her way into the home, citing concerns that she was having due to not hearing from Cassidy in some time. When it had seemed as though her friend was about to give up and leave, Jessica managed to break through the barrier that was her brother for a second time and entered the home regardless. The moment was upended. The girl that she had only met nearly a month ago barged into the space that was being reconsecrated with little abandon, her very presence causing Cassidy's new inhabitant to stir in gleeful anticipation. Neither the condemnation of the Reverend nor the rebuke she faced from Arthur or Sandra deterred her from the mission she was sent on, most likely from Lydia. Jessica stood at the entrance to the dining room and folded her arms. The rebel of a girl wore the attire of one that was used to entering places no teenager should enter. Dark eyeliner accentuated her youthful sunbathed face. At once, Cassidy remembered why the invader was there. She had forgotten about the rally the coven was to protest at. "There you are, Cass," Jessica said as though she was smiling, but she wasn't. "Looks like I got here right on time. Come on, we're about to be late for the meetup." "Jess, Cassidy was about to say. "Excuse me, miss." Martha moved in front of Cassidy. "Cassidy isn't ready to play with you today, so please leave. She'll see you another time." "Is that right?" Jessica's smile appeared. The walls in the home seemed to move in on Cassidy as her gut tightened. It was the worst of scenarios she knew would present itself, but for it to occur then didn't seem to be a coincidence. For the longest time, Cassidy had battled with her identity, and when she had joined the witches, she thought that her search was over. The way how she was cared for by her sisters was the kind of attention she was after the entire time, but that was to be challenged by what she was born to accept as right. There seemed to be no way to avoid the influence of the church. Everything that was said in the last few moments with the visiting clergy was a testament to that. "Cassidy, come on," Jessica taunted. "Or do you want to stay with the oppressors?" "I think that you have the wrong impression of the church, young lady," the Reverend interjected. "The only ones oppressed are those who continue to live with no standards. Is it oppression to be led through the worst times of your life by a doctrine that has been tested for thousands of years? To be held to account by the one who created the very earth that you're standing on? The air that you take for granted every time you blaspheme?" Jessica's eyes narrowed on the Reverend, her ire seeming to direct itself at the light within him. Cassidy cast her gaze around the room at everyone gathered and let herself think for a little. What she was going to do had plagued her. The thought of abandoning her commitment to the ones she had promised herself to seemed like a sin in itself, but a sin to who? There was no specific god or goddess to stoke the flames of retribution against with the witches. For all intent and purposes, she was her own in that regard, able to take control of the primordial in accordance with her own will. Jessica was living proof that the ability to take charge was as simple as willing it to be, the transmogrification of her identity being hers by birthright. On the other hand, the Christians and their dependence on a God that would destroy them if they stepped out of line, seemed to be more masochistic than peaceful. But the lessons from the generations past seemed to make up for the supposed sadism. Cassidy wondered if she should speak. Jess, can we talk later? I think. No. Jessica's judgmental gaze stabbed Cassidy in the stomach. You swore yourself to the coven and to Mother. Do you always abandon your commitments so easily? Is this group of child molesting groomers the family you wish to stay with? Here, Mr. Holy Man, I'll make this easy on all of us. Choose this day, Cassidy, who you're going to serve. This lot and their pretend God, or yourself and the sisters that helped you when you were ready to end it all. There was no backing out or stalling anymore. Cassidy had to make a choice. She wanted to be with everyone, to have everyone accept her for who she was and what she wanted to be. But what was that? What did she want to be? Was it a witch of the Blackroot Coven, beholden to herself and the ones who called her sister? Was it a Christian, given to the one and true God of creation itself? Was she meant to walk the line between both or abandon them completely? She tried to force an answer out of herself with as much effort as possible, but no answer was given. There was no coercion that compelled her in one way or the other. The choice was truly her own to make. South, the Pinewood High School Incident. Chapter 7. Time seemed to pass her by as the white sedan maneuvered through the thin streets of Pinewood. There were a lot of things going through her mind at the time, but she didn't know what to focus on first. The way her mother looked when she decided to go with Jessica, how utterly defeated she seemed, sent a shiver through her that persisted through a turn at a stop sign. She thought on how Arthur's judgmental gaze flew from Jessica to her with the same admonishment, as if she were a stranger to him, just the same. As Cassidy held herself, doing her best to comfort her aching soul, Jessica decided to intervene. It's not like you're going to miss out on anything, Cass, she tried. Trust me, the further you are away from that snore fest, the better. You really think so? Cassidy searched for an answer. I mean, what else is there without God? You, Jessica's bluntness assured Cassidy of her authenticity. They were on a mission to pick up some of the other girls before the rally. Penelope lived in Slayton, so she was going to be the last one they got. The second closest was Tara, who lived in Bankwood, and Heather, whose house they were approaching first, on the border of Pinewood. The quaint little home was situated on the main road that led into the poorest of the cities, and was surprisingly smaller than Cassidy's. She had assumed that all of the girls were rich like Jessica, but watching the thin girl leave her tiny home by struggling with a broken screen door made her feel oddly superior to her. When she was in the car, Heather presented them with bottles of ice-cold soda she had stashed in her purse. Can't go anywhere without hydrating first. Heather's overreaching enthusiasm made Cassidy feel a little better. I promise you that this girl will pull the most random things from her bag. Jessica couldn't help herself from giggling. As they continued on their journey, Heather continued to probe the girls on their recent dealings. Cassidy was sure that the amateur investigator was going to ask her about what had happened with her earlier, but to her surprise, the only question that Heather could muster were those pertaining to school. Cassidy divulged to her that she was still going to school despite what had happened, which shocked Heather, but she accepted it nonetheless. Cassidy left out the fact that she still hadn't seen Amber, mainly because she didn't want to give too much of herself out to the nosy witch, but also because she wanted to protect Amber's right to privacy. The short ride came to another stop at another small home, which made Cassidy question if she was the real judgmental one. "Hey, sisters." Tara's hair was in long braids, the same as that janitor from before. "Are you ready to tear down the patriarchy?" "Don't let Tara fool you, Cass." Jessica gave her a side eye. "She's perfectly fine with being a cam girl for the same system she's against." "It pays the bills, sweetheart." Tara met Jessica's sarcasm. "Lead them in and suck them dry." "You would know, wouldn't you?" Heather sneered as she extended another cold soda from her bag to Tara. The girls maintained their explicit banter well into the drive. When they had exited the tunnel leading into Slayton, it took them over 10 minutes to reach the final home. It was situated on a side road just before a bridge that crossed a channel of water. On that street were nice brick homes that returned Cassidy's sense of comparative poverty, each home featuring dual car garages and well-kept lawns. At the far end of the street was their destination, a large 2-story home featuring a white stone facade, as pure as snow. There wasn't a fountain, which made Cassidy assume that Jessica was the richest, but for what it had lacked in features, it made up in presentation. Prepare yourself for the queen of safe spaces." Heather's sneering remark ended with a giggle. As soon as Jessica pulled into the driveway, Penelope made her way out of the front door and entered the car. She was wearing a long skirt and loose top that made her look like a poster flower child. Cassidy instantly took notice to her white fabric bag and felt, for the first time in her life, a little jealous that she didn't have one. As Jessica prepared to pull off, Heather decided to challenge the new arrival. "You do know that we're going to a protest, right?" Her face crumpling at her eyebrows. "That doesn't mean I have to look like it." Penelope smiled at her attacker. "Besides, I'm hot, and we might have to take pictures." "Leave it to Penny." Jessica chuckled as she backed her car out of the driveway and began the journey to their destination. "Nothing's going to hurt you, baby." The trip to downtown Slayton was shorter than Cassidy had wanted it to be, but when they had finally arrived, she noticed that there was an exceptional amount of police presence, the kind of security that would be expected of a president. They spent the majority of nearly 30 minutes waiting to park, but when they managed to get to a spot, they breathed a bit easier despite the fact that they were far from the location of the rally. As they piled out of the car, the girls collected their signs and other materials from Jessica's trunk. When that was done, Cassidy stood next to Jessica to receive her next orders. "This is your first time being to something like this, right?" Jessica began in a tone that was as sympathetic as possible. "Don't worry. We're only going to be making a stand against Laverty with words, nothing else." "What did he do?" Cassidy asked, although she overheard most of the key points on the car ride over. "It isn't what he did, it's what he isn't doing." Jessica seemed to look disappointed at Cassidy for a split second. "Why do you think the last year had been hard on you, besides your dad? It's because of what you've been putting into your body during that time." "I know what you might start thinking. that this is some sort of conspiracy theory or whatever. But the truth has been in front of us the entire time. It's the food, Cass. All of the processes that were used during the start of the industrial age has led us to where we are as a people now, overweight and constantly depressed. By this time, Penelope had begun to paint the girls' faces, with Heather and Tara conducting inventory checks of their personal effects. Cassidy was made to hand over her phone, which Penelope placed in her bag, the rest of her effects being placed in the trunk. Jessica held a stoic stance aimed in the location of the gathering supporters of Brett, her mind seemingly trapped on something. We have to fight against this tyranny of man. She turned to face Cassidy. Southern Cuts was one of the first businesses to take up the fight for better food and health. I know you've been thinking, even though most of us live in other cities, why we're attending Pinewood High, right? It's because when the city stopped funding it due to low test scores or whatever, the company came in and changed everything. They're the first school to incentivize healthier food in schools. Our overall health and well-being has improved by scores, something that Miss Hadley took notice to and formed our coven. That's why we're here, Cass, to look the monsters that would send us back into darkness and tell them no. Preach, sister. Heather did her best impression of a Southern churchgoer. When the girls were finished painting themselves in green paint and donning picket signs that read, "End old meat" and "Eat the bloom, save the world," they began their walk to the designated spot where their protest was allowed, Jessica continuing her lesson along the way. Cassidy listened intently on what Jessica was saying, but also to how the other girls were reacting. Heather and Penelope continued to tease each other, while Tara shifted her gaze around the tall buildings they were walking between. They didn't seem worried or stressed, the evening sun illuminating their path as though they were there to enjoy the city. So what does all of that mean for me? Cassidy decided to push back against Jessica a bit. You say that it was my choices, what I consumed, that has led me to feeling how I had been for so long. But what about everything else? We can't just ignore that there are other factors at play in our lives, right? That's true, Cass. Jessica seemed sure of herself. But let's think further into it. What is the real issue? How long has this been going on? People and their dependence on convenience. I mentioned it before, right? When the industrial age came about, it changed humanity. We can't ignore it. That change affected every generation that came since. A perpetual cycle of people being infected with chemicals, genetic modifications, and other indiscriminate microbes. We are so far from what humanity was before that age began, but we've kept trying to fit the same ideals within our societies. Hey, we're here. Tara interrupted the girls. Get ready. They had reached a gated section of the city street that led to where the rally was being conducted, and Cassidy noticed that there were others who, she was sure, were protesting as well. There were several police officers standing in front of the gates that were admitting people past them in small groups. She assumed that it was a sort of checkpoint, but something didn't feel right to her. The way the officers were spaced didn't seem to lead credence to effective security procedure. For instance, once it was the girls' time to enter the barricade, they did so with ease. The only proof of their identity, or what they had on their person, was a quick once-over by a female cop, and they were in. I thought that there would be more, Cassidy said as she looked around her. More what? Security? Jessica grinned. He's only a councilman. Past the blockade was an opening that split along two sides. One side had another blockade where two officers were guarding an entrance. The other side was where Cassidy had assumed they were going to go. An open path where people were herded towards the stage area. She was stunned at how far they were from the main stage, even going beyond that point, the journey reaching its conclusion after another several minutes of walking. When they finally were near the stage, Cassidy gasped as to the amount of people that were in attendance. Surrounding the main stage were nearly 1,000 people, all of them maintaining a loud chatter as people continued to pour in. Cassidy had seen concerts on TV before, but what she was witnessing in person was nothing like she had thought. This is, she wanted to finish. Don't get your hopes up, Tara nudged her. We're going over to where the opposition is. More walking, about another minute, saw them nearing another street that was sectioned off by a large metal fence. Cassidy instantly knew that they were in the right spot as, upon further inspection of the people around them, she saw that they were painted, although in varying colors and designs, the same as they were. Chants and other obscenities were being hurled at the nearby officers that seemed to be keeping their cool. A few women that were about a few feet away from her began flashing a cameraman that looked like he was with the news. The gathered crowd that she was supposed to be standing with made her feel uncertain about everything she had thought up to that point. Welcome to the front lines, Heather cackled. The girls got themselves positioned to an area as close to the stage as possible, a space nearest the edge of the gated area. Heather handed Cassidy a picket sign and led her and the others into a huddle. When the girls were circling each other, Tara shared the chants that they were supposed to shout. She and Gabriella had worked together to come up with their chants over the week, but due to a family emergency, Gabriella couldn't make it. After being coached on what to shout, the girls separated and prepared to be as loud as possible. Although they were around people who seemed to be as eccentric as they were, Cassidy felt a familiar nervousness creep up on her. The weight of standing out made her shiver with uncertainty. It was time. At the sound of a typical political instrumental, Cassidy felt her stomach tighten as she stood next to her sisters, all of them maintaining a look of determination as they readied themselves for their fight. The typical orchestral piece sent shockwaves through the gathered protesters from the stage speakers, the music nearly being drowned out by the roaring witnesses. A person took to the stage to announce the speaker, and she thought that the girls would begin their chants then, but she looked at Jessica and her mouth fell open. Jessica was crying. Jess. Cassidy tried to approach her, but was suddenly pushed aside by Tara. No meat, more greens, Tara and Heather shouted in unison. The planet is on its knees. Brett Laverty is a liar, Penelope shouted alongside other protesters that joined in. He wants to keep you sick. We found the cure. Cassidy heard Jessica finally join the fray. The algae meat works. This went on for some time, their chanting seemingly not loud enough to reach past the growing crowd of Brett's supporters. Cassidy tried to join in as much as she could, but she also felt her throat nearly giving out. There were camera crews that were walking by, and a few managed to stop in front of them, their cameras trained on the girls' painted faces. Cassidy wondered if she was going to be on the news later, but as soon as she thought about her mother finding out where she was, the gathered crowd of supporters began shouting as the announcer welcomed Brett Laverty to the stage. Cassidy stopped chanting and watched as the man they were there for walked onto the stage, her body burning with an irrational rage. Councilman Brett Laverty was a man that stood like how Cassidy remembered her father would stand, a type of confidence that seemed to register authority over the people he governed. She thought about how he would constantly be at odds with her father, in the littlest of ways, recounting moments in her life where he would chastise her because of her unmotivated demeanor and lack of drive. She never saw the point in trying so hard for a system that was as broken as the one the people in her life lived. But to him, and people like Brett, they seemed to do whatever they wanted with ease. The rage that kept her warm began to steep into the feeling that she was more familiar with than any other: hatred. God bless you, people of Slayton, and those throughout the entire Allura Shores community, Brett began. I wanted to begin by saying that I know that there is plenty of support for supposed quick solutions to humanity, but I want to let it be known now that me and my allies are against the unregulated methods employed by corporate overreach, the abuse of trust when it comes to the production of goods in our community and country. The crowd cheered. Jerome Cadwell and those like him represent everything considered un-American as it pertains to good faith business conduct. These monopolistic practices have plagued our lives for too long, and it is time that we let our voices be heard, not only at the local level, but at all socio-economic levels. The stance against his injection of gene-altering products into our school system must be felt, not only at the personal level, but in the boardrooms across America. This is the solution that will fix the exploitation of our systems and ensure that we are not subjecting our children to experimentation, the greedy practices of a greedy organization. As we gear up this November to meet Congress head on with our demands, I assure you, good people of Virginia, that your frustrations will be let known. Let's end the exploitation of our children, our community, and our very futures. The roars of the supporters rang throughout the area and made Cassidy grit her teeth. The fact that so many people were in direct support of ending something that had the potential to heal them, to be what saved starving children in underdeveloped countries, made her stomach churn. She wondered how depraved a person would have to be in order to accept such a rhetoric from someone like him. She looked around at the growing number of protesters and wondered what else they could do to make their voices louder. She pondered to herself for a bit before returning to her chants, being approached by Heather a moment soon after. "Cass," she said as she fought her way past someone who was dancing between them, "I need my bag from the car. Stick close to everyone and wait for me. I'll be back, okay?" Cassidy watched as Heather disappeared in the crowd of growing protesters and wondered what was so important that the free-form witch had to wander off for. With a shrug of her shoulder, Cassidy refocused on the speech that Brett was giving, standing beside Tara and Penelope while waving the picket sign with growing enthusiasm. The speech reached a crescendo as the supporter crowd shouted their praise of the politician, the man who was going to champion their cause. She felt herself wanting to punch the man in his face and continued to play her part with her sisters until, without warning, something that had sounded like loud pops cracked the late evening air and made her knees grow weak. There was a gunman. Screams erupted from everywhere as Brett fell on stage, the gathering of protesters and supporters scattering into a conglomerate of panicked people. Cassidy didn't know what to do. She was frozen in place as people dashed from the scene with their heads covered, shoving each other as they did so. She was so focused on the movement of the crowd that she didn't notice that she was being violently shaken by Tara, her attention finally making its way onto the screaming teen witch. "Cassidy, snap out of it!" Tara's face was filled with uncertainty. "Come on, we have to go." "Jess," Cassidy stammered. "Where's Jess and Penny?" "They're already heading to the car. Come on." Tara grabbed Cassidy's arm hard and led her away. The chilled autumn air numbed her lungs as Cassidy ran as fast as she could behind Tara. She felt like she wasn't running fast enough, but continued to run either way, nearly tripping in the process. When they were nearly back to where the split opening was, a flood of people blocked their path, shoving and trampling each other in an attempt to escape the gunman. The witches tried to dance around the fleeing protesters at first and almost managed to find a way past them, but Cassidy was clipped by a fleeing woman and fell to the pavement. She tried to get back to her feet, but was forced back down by a larger body. Someone else fell directly on top of her, which caused the air she was fighting to keep in her body from reaching her lungs. "Help!" Cassidy wanted to scream, but couldn't. She could hear Tara shouting from somewhere and tried to get to her feet again, but it was of no use. The crowd was too dense, and the light from the fading sun was too dim to make out much. By means of pure luck, Cassidy was able to get a moment to focus and located a nearby clearing, but before she could attempt a crawl, she was kicked in the face by another fleeing person and nearly lost consciousness. She could feel the blood leaking from her face and, for the first time since before losing her father, felt fear at the thought of dying. Her fear mixed with the anger of being held down by the crowd, which stoked a quick determination, allowing her to get to her knees and attempt the crawl again. She did so and made her way to the clearing in time to regroup with Tara. "Cassidy!" Tara was shaking as she examined her. Did you get shot?" "No." Cassidy forced her words through the blood that continued to flow past her lips. "Just trampled." "That's good, all things considered," Tara said as she caught her breath. "Come on, we can force ourselves around the other side." Tara grabbed Cassidy and helped her wipe her face before continuing their trek through the madness of the fleeing people. They maintained their efforts together through the side wall near the other entrance that was guarded by the officers earlier. They weren't there anymore, which Cassidy assumed was due to them trying to find the shooter, and managed to locate an alternative exit carved out by other crowd members. A few of the people managed to smash the front door of a corner storefront and were either hiding within or shuffling through, exiting on the other side via a smashed window. Cassidy began to feel tired as part of her vision turned red, the blood from her wound still flowing. "Do you think we're almost out?" she said softly. What? Tara said rather than asked. Keep moving, Cass. Here, let me help you up. We're almost to the car, so don't give up. Lydia's going to get an earful after this performance. Best not die, Cass, or we'll have to find another mother. Who am I kidding? Plausible deniability, right? Yeah, right. Cassidy found herself wanting to chuckle a little at the thought of Lydia denying sending the girls out. That would be the worst thing to happen to her. With each step, she could feel her body wanting to stop, her dizziness influencing her to collapse to the ground. Suddenly, as the girls reached the beginning to the parking lot, they spotted Jessica on the ground being arrested by two officers. Tara, not thinking, released her hold on Cassidy and made her way closer to the scene of the arrest. Cassidy watched as the brown-skinned witch went from a casual walk to a mad sprint towards the scene. Within a few more seconds, Tara had crashed into the officers and managed to free Jessica, only to be caught and turned. Cassidy didn't know what to do in that moment, but she felt it tugging on her. The entity, no, the demon, wanting to take over for her. Why? I could just go home. I could just give up. No, that's not right, is it? Not after everything that's happened. I left Mom and Arthur behind. There's no forgiveness waiting for me. I'm nothing without them, right? I can feel you. I don't know what to call you, but just for now, she said as she closed her eyes and focused on the devourer within. Let me save my sisters. Yes. It was free. Cassidy's body felt less burdensome than before, it stretching as it stood tall and releasing what one would consider a roar that sent her hurtling towards the officers. When she reached the scene, Cassidy kicked the officer that was atop Jessica with enough force to send them tumbling a good distance away. By this time, the officer that was struggling with Tara had gotten to their feet and was about to draw their weapon on Cassidy, but she was faster. With a quick sprint towards the officer that she would have never accomplished before, Cassidy launched a single punch to the officer's temple that dropped them instantly. The only issue that arose from her aiding her sisters in that way was the fact that she couldn't stop punching the officer in the face. Cassidy! Jessica was struggling to keep the mad witch from killing the officer. Cassidy, stop! What? Cassidy said as she stopped short of continuing her assault. It's done. Let's go. Cassidy discarded the limp body of the officer and followed her sisters into the parking lot at their pace. They were sprinting with all of their might, but Cassidy couldn't feel any of it, the only thing she could feel being her fever-like temperature. Nearly a half-minute later saw the three witches approaching Jessica's car, Penelope and Heather arguing about something as they approached. Whatever the argument was seemed to be serious enough as, just before they announced themselves, Penelope slapped Heather, the two of them needing to be held back by both Cassidy and Tara. Tell them! Penelope lost her easy personality for a moment. Tell them what you did. What I was told to do, Heather shot back. What do you think we are, little princess? Why do you think that we're here? Enough, you two. Jessica took back command. Get in the car. We'll talk about this at the farm. Cassidy, sit up front. You have some explaining to do. Compared to the ride to the rally, everyone was silent the entire time, no one making an effort to comment on anything as the white sedan made its way into Charleston Heights. Tara seemed to whimper a little as she sat in between Penelope and Heather, but Cassidy didn't pay much attention to it. After all, she had her own issues to deal with, primarily figuring out how to abate Jessica's suspicion of her. When they entered the gate to the farm and drove up the roundabout to the front door, the girls stepped out into the cold night air and went inside after collecting their things from the trunk. Before Cassidy could enter the home, Jessica pulled her aside, a tension growing palpable with each moment. Cass, what was that back there? Jessica's question made Cassidy unsure as to if their relationship was in jeopardy. You looked. Cassidy, you didn't look like yourself when... It happened the night of the effigy burning. Cassidy looked away. I did the sage burning and I thought that I purged the house, but it followed me. Jess, when I was going to bed that night, it entered me. I can feel it clawing at me sometimes when I get agitated or stressed. It likes violence. Reverend Jacobs called it a demon, but it feels like it's something more than that. The scariest part about it is that it can take over, and I like it when it does. Jessica took a step away from Cassidy, which made Cassidy lower her gaze to the stone-paved roundabout. She figured that being possessed by some spirit or demon was enough in any other rational person's book to warrant disowning them at the very least. But Jessica wasn't a random person to her. A theory made fact by Jessica deciding to approach her for a hug. Once the embrace was finished, Jessica held her at length by the shoulders and inspected her briefly. Thank you for protecting me, sister, Jessica said with a stern expression. We're going to have to get Lydia to check you out, though. We need to determine the intent of this spirit. For now, let's eat and get some rest. We'll figure it out tomorrow, okay? Yeah, okay. Cassidy nodded her head repeatedly. Hey, Jess. Thanks for not leaving me to deal with all of this alone. As the night progressed, the girls spent the majority of it in the large front room, their eyes fixed on the large TV that featured the late-night news segment with their faces plastered on it. Tara giggled and made some sly comments about the way how their painted faces looked, but she was the only one laughing. Penelope sat alone on the large sectional furthest away from the others and lay her head down as if falling asleep. Heather, after making a run through Jessica's fridge, sat beside Jessica and Cassidy and shared some chips with them. They were as relaxed as could be for what had transpired only a few hours ago, but they knew that there were going to be consequences to come. At least for the moment, Cassidy told herself, they could take it easy. The pain in Cassidy's head met her before the daylight did, as she opened her eyes slowly to meet the day in Jessica's king-size bed. The mountain of a bed was soft and covered in white sheets that Cassidy oddly recognized before the sound of the other girls sporadically positioned around her. The floor was cluttered with the makeshift sleeping quarters of all the other witches except Jessica, the only one who slept beside her. As she gazed around the room, she felt something that she couldn't quite understand, a type of feeling that made her smile and feel upset at the same time. As she got out of bed, tiptoed around the sleeping girls, and made her way to the bathroom that was located on the other side of the room, she understood what that feeling was and couldn't stop smiling. "Thank you," she said, as though the meager compensation was enough. It was a nice bathroom, the type that home decorating channels would showcase after renovations. It housed a shower and tub combination and stocked toiletries, as if she were at a hotel room. Cassidy took a look at herself in the mirror and saw that she had washed up the majority of the way, but she needed to finish the work. There was still blood trapped in her roots. As she undressed to take a shower, an echo gripped her ear. "Cass." It was so faint, but Cassidy knew that she heard it. It was the sort of sound that would only come from the deepest part of a person's subconscious, but was as clear as if someone was speaking next to them. Cassidy spun around to try and gauge who or what was watching her, but when she could find no one presently in the large bathroom with her, she decided to ignore it and proceed with her shower regardless. As she went on with the task of cleaning herself, she felt it watching her again. The sudden awareness made her tense as she rinsed the flowery shampoo from her hair. Once she was finished, she wrapped herself in a bathrobe and proceeded with brushing her teeth with the gifted toothbrush that they all were given before bed. As she completed that task, however, she was forced around by a quick and searing pull of her spirit by what she had assumed to be the demon. "Cassidy!" She could hear it calling to her, manipulating her from within. "No," she mustered. "You listen to me. I didn't ask for you, but you helped me yesterday. I don't know what you are. Maybe you are a demon. But this is my body too, okay? I'm in control. Do you hear me? This is my body." The bathroom was silent. The presence of the entity inside of her had seemed to retreat after her affirmation, the consequence of which made Cassidy feel slightly more comfortable as she redressed, made her way past the still sleeping girls, and into the inner sanctum that was Jessica's house. As she walked along the raised ceiling hallways, she wondered what it must have been like to wake up that way every morning, and continued to exhume her wanderlust as she peered into the kitchen. There was a spread of breakfast food set up for the girls that extended the length of the large farmhouse-style dining table. Cassidy walked along the spread and sampled a few items before spotting a cereal that she wanted. She began her hunt throughout the kitchen for where the bowls were and found one in the dishwasher by the sink. She rinsed the stoneware bowl out and made herself a picturesque bowl of cereal to enjoy while looking out of the sliding back door at the field where she rode Goldilocks. She was so at peace that she didn't notice that she was being watched. "It suits you, you know." A voice startled Cassidy from directly behind her. Cassidy shot around to find Jessica admiring her as if she were a newly created piece of artwork ready for display. She did her best to finish the cereal that was in her mouth before speaking, but Jessica beat her to the punch. She held out her hand in a way that suggested that she didn't need to worry herself with responding, before walking up to the spread and taking a few grapes. Cassidy watched her as she made her way further into the kitchen to get a carton to drink from out of the refrigerator and walked back over to her. Cassidy couldn't help but admire that, even when she was just waking up, how beautiful Jessica was, her flawless skin shining as it met the rays of the sun. "You could stay here with me, you know," Jessica said as she looked past Cassidy at the same sight. "My mom wouldn't even know. She's barely here as it is." "What is she like?" Cassidy chose her words. "You only showed me pictures." "She's independent," Jessica said with a glance to her right shoulder. There were always touchy topics when it came to family matters, and Cassidy, of all people, understood perfectly. She liked how open Jessica was with her, and had recently felt obligated to adhere to whatever she said, but she also knew that their familiarity was only partial. She was used to Amber being shameless, and didn't want to let her lack of awareness cause damage to their budding trust in each other. After getting an eyeful of Jessica's perfect bed hair, Cassidy turned back to the glass door and enjoyed the moment. "She didn't take the divorce well, but the house helped," Jessica said as she put another grape into her mouth. "Divorce?" Cassidy forgot not to pry. "To my dad." Jessica stopped eating her grapes. "Did you enjoy meeting him?" Cassidy audibly gasped and caused Jessica to break her gaze up the property to witness the shock of her revelation. A moment passed between them as Cassidy tried to process the feelings that were mixed within her mind. Where at first she thought she had a beat on Jessica and her situation, she had no idea that they were more alike than she could imagine. Cassidy didn't notice it, but she had begun to tear up, Jessica helping her realize this by using her non-grape hand to wipe away at her cheek. As she tried to swallow away the emotions, Jessica gave her a smile. "You see, Cassidy," she leaned in heavy into her smile, as if to prevent herself from crying as well. "We really are sisters." South. The Pinewood High School Incident. Chapter 8. The morning progressed, and the two soon found themselves surrounded by the other coven members, all of them seated around a large table, engaging in a type of merriment that Cassidy could only dream of after seeing posts of parties on Hunter. With each passing of food from one of the girls to another, a part of her felt warm and comforted at the lack of boundaries and rules. Here were the icons of her school, the pinnacle of feminine perfection, and she was considered their equal. As she fought the urge to pinch herself, Cassidy joined in on the feast, occasionally taking glances at the head of the table to Jessica. "Girls, I'd like to say something," Jessica decided to say after a while. "I'd like to congratulate you all on a mostly successful protest." "Yeah, it went down pretty well, right?" Tara chimed in after finishing the food in her mouth. "We had a lot of trouble out of the other protesters, though. Who would have thought that one of them would bring a gun to stop the show?" "Yeah, about that," Heather said as she reached into a bag she brought to the table. "Full transparency, right?" At first, Cassidy didn't think much about the act, but when she heard a thud echo throughout the table, she looked at the small black item that was placed and held her hand at her mouth. There, placed in front of everyone, was a pistol, the presence of which made the room grow silent. Her pulse quickened as she studied the weapon and thought back on the reason why Heather excused herself to her. Everyone maintained their gaze on the object until Heather began to speak again. "I'm sorry I caused so much trouble for you, Cassidy," Heather said honestly. "I wanted you to be as far from the trouble because you're new, but orders are orders." "I can't believe you, Heather," Penelope folded her arms. "And don't tell me that it was all Mother's plan. She knows how I feel about guns. This sort of behavior is what they expect from our side." "What's the matter, Penny?" Heather smiled. "I thought you clairvoyant types were able to see everything." "We needed to show that we were serious about keeping that monster from hurting people." Heather reached for her cup and took a few sips before continuing. "Don't worry, sis. It was just to make a little noise. Besides, it's not like that self-righteous prick was going to get hit, not with all of those sheep licking his boots." Cassidy's gaze instantly fell on Jessica, who was looking intently on the plate of fruit in front of her. She didn't know how to take the sudden confession or what to say that would help ease Jessica's thoughts, fighting the impulse to blurt out something about her father. After a moment of inner deliberation, she decided on what she could say, and with a forced smile, she nodded to her fellow witches. "Thank you, Heather." Her gaze was still on the weapon. "It's scary to think that it was us that did that, but we're safe and together. That's all that matters, right?" There was a moment of silence as all the girls held their tongues, Cassidy taking the hint and lowering her gaze to mimic Jessica. After a little while, Jessica lifted her head and placed her hands on the table. She looked around the table and confirmed that the others were feeling the same way she was. A wave of anxiety and uncertainty had managed to sit at the table with them. For how calm she was, Cassidy wondered what Jessica was honestly thinking about Brett, wondering if she was planning to secretly steal away to a hospital or meet her mother wherever the politician was hiding. It didn't take much longer for her to get an answer, however, as when Jessica had finished another bunch of grapes, she sat tall in her chair to address her juniors. "Thank you for being honest, Heather," Jessica began. "I know that you all know about me and my relationship to Councilman Laverty. I don't have anything to do with that man anymore, and my feelings for him are nostalgic at best. You placed us in a good amount of danger, Heather, regardless of your intent. We don't use the weapons of men to deal with our enemies. I'll have to talk to Mother about this later." "I understand." Heather accepted the terms with a formality that seemed foreign to everyone watching. It took a moment for the girls to get comfortable enough to resume their personal conversations. But as things began to pick up between Penelope and Tara, Cassidy's phone rang. A few giggles escaped Heather as the singing cat ringtone echoed throughout the dining room. She excused herself and went into the hallway to see who it was that was calling, her desire wanting the person to be James. As she was prepared to further cement the expectation, she paused everything when she saw the name of the caller, her gut constricting under the pressure of her memory. It was her mother. "Hello." Cassidy sounded as distant as one would sound when addressing a stranger. "Are you okay?" Sandra was careful. "Yes." "Can you come home?" she tried. Cassidy felt her fist clench at her mother's plea. It was strange to be asked something so trivial, for it to be coming from her mother of all people. She was always so good for her and her dad, never speaking out of turn or causing much fuss in the time she was able to remember. By this time, Cassidy was in the long hallway that led to the dining room, making sure to take her time as she paced through the area. When she felt confident to respond to the pleading woman, She did her best to not sound like an ungrateful brat. I think that I want to stay where I am for now, Mom. She could tell that her mother was upset by how long it took for her to respond. I would like for you to come home, okay? I need you to help me. Your brother has a job coming up, and we need your help to... I said no, Mom. Cassidy was louder than she wanted to be. I'll be home when I feel like coming home. Honestly, you and Arthur pulling that little stunt with Reverend Jacobs was the last straw. Just leave me alone for right now, okay? Back off. With that, Cassidy hung up the phone and leaned against the nearby wall to catch her breath. She could feel her anger building as she thought on how desperate her mother sounded, how feeble the older woman was pretending to be. It was because of the accident that her mother lost the power she once had, and hearing her beg for help made her want to punch a wall. Whoa, Cassidy, Heather's voice reached her. Easy on the malice, okay? Sorry. Cassidy fixed her face. I was talking to my mother. Oh, it's one of those stories, huh? Heather walked closer. My mom's always on my case too. She just doesn't get it, you know? Here we are, young and in the best times of our lives, and these old hags keep trying to tell us what to do. I'm glad Lydia isn't like that, or I would not be here. Right. Cassidy let her voice trail off. She suddenly realized that, despite spending the night with her, she didn't know much of anything about Heather. Besides her being a gun owner, or at least known to be able to use one, the girl was a mystery. The other girls talked about how she was a gutter witch, something she had assumed was a slur at first, but was told by Jessica that it was a legitimate craft. She took notice to a charm that the witch wore on her wrist, a braided cord with amethyst beads protecting a silver pendant, and decided to use that to probe further. Hey, Heather. Cassidy prepared herself. Why are you here? So blunt. I see why Jessica likes you. Heather smiled as she stopped short of Cassidy's reach. I'm here because when I was little, there was a fortune teller at a carnival that I went to. The old lady didn't know what she was doing, but it didn't matter. It was enough to spark my curiosity. That's it, right? Why do any of us do anything when it comes to life and living? Curiosity may kill cats, but it makes people smarter, right? Anyway, I'm here because I was curious, and Lydia gives me answers. Heather stared at Cassidy, unsure as to what else could be given to her in terms of an answer to the question. Cassidy took the hint and avoided the girl's gaze with a nod of her head, something she had hoped would ease the awkwardness between them. It didn't, as when Cassidy thought that the worst of the encounter was over, Heather walked up as close as possible to Cassidy and stared into her eyes. You asked me. Now it's your turn. Heather didn't flinch. Why are you here? When Lydia told me to help you during the effigy burning, I didn't expect for you to contact a spirit. I've seen that you've stopped hiding your scars. Even the one you got from the rally is gone. Jessica's concerned that you're not ready for what you've been getting involved in recently. But really, why? Cassidy tried to pull the answer from thin air. Power, Cassidy. Heather backed off and began to walk away. It's the only thing that matters to anyone. Whether you want to avoid it or own it, power is what brought us together. You're coming into your own power now. Penny helped you to see that, as well as me and the others. You have to accept what's in you for what it is. Give it what it wants. Heather walked away without giving Cassidy anything else to go on. The wild card of a girl paced away to another corner of the mansion as if their conversation never happened. Filing it away in her vast library of thoughts, Cassidy decided to wander around a bit to familiarize herself with her new dwellings. There were some new details to the home that she didn't take notice to the last time that she was there. The gas fireplace in the main room that was turned on thanks to the cooler temperatures plaguing the area recently. She came across what she had assumed to be Brett's old office, a large wooden desk and matching empty bookshelves being the only thing remaining of him. "Why would you give this up?" she asked as she folded her arms in the doorway. Cassidy continued to wander around the home a bit, her thoughts on the litany of conversations and emotions spinning around her. Heather was right. She was in a place that she had never been and felt as though she were an imposter. The thought that she was willingly contacting a demon, that she was being controlled by it, and that she was unnaturally healing because of it made her shiver. Power, something that she felt she didn't have before, was intoxicating, and she loved it. The very thought exciting her into the idea of never being a victim again. As she walked, she saw the other witches going about, doing various little things to themselves that seemed to be busy work. Tara was moving a few things for Jessica outside, some boxes and other odds and ends. Penelope was meditating in a space away from everyone else, something that made Cassidy think back to Heather's comment about safe spaces. Speaking of which, the fellow wanderer was dancing through the place while listening to music on her headphones. The easy atmosphere made her forget about her mother and Arthur, the anguish of their predicament being replaced with the ambient joy and freeness of the coven. As she made her way to the front of the mansion, the chime of the doorbell brought her back to earth. "Hey, Cass, can you get that?" Jessica shouted from another room. Like a good subordinate, Cassidy walked to the front door without reservation. To her, it didn't matter who was on the other side of the door. Even if it were Brett himself, she felt confident enough to handle anything the world had to throw at her. The glass panels of the front door gave away that it were 3 people on the other side. One of them a familiar frame, and the others she wasn't too sure. She turned the handle and prepared to greet her rescuer with a smile she knew she never gave before, and when she was ready, she pulled the door open. "Hello, Mother." Cassidy's enthusiasm fell with her smile as she saw the other person that wasn't supposed to be there. "Cassidy, you look well rested." Lydia returned a smile that didn't feel as innocent. "Gabriella, go and make me a cup of tea, please. I trust you remember Brittany." Nothing had changed in the house between the other girls as their leader entered and made herself comfortable. Everyone maintaining their high spirits except Cassidy. Her demeanor towards the rest of the girls shifted from the comfortable state she enjoyed into a piercing anxiety as she eyed her bully. Brittany seemed to catch on after the two glanced at each other at the same time and, as if wanting the same thing, motioned to meet away from the others. The stoic girl made her way down an empty hallway, and she followed suit, much more confident that she was not in any real danger than previously thought. The two met near the bedrooms, Brittany taking a moment to look at the large master room that Cassidy explored earlier. The girl's shock at the scale of such a room would have been cute to Cassidy if she wasn't aware of why they were there to begin with. As if understanding her feelings, Brittany turned to face the cautious girl while leaning against the door frame with folded arms. "So, did you find out the answer yet?" The girl took initiative. "When did you—" Cassidy's surprise at her bully's sudden appearance overtook her. "What are you doing here? This coven has done nothing but help me, and it doesn't need someone with negative energy bringing it down." "You really don't pay attention, do you?" The bully smiled. "I tried to get you to understand, but I guess you're committed to the game. They even got you on the news. Do me a favor, daddy killer." Brittany straightened herself. "Things are going to move fast from this point on. You can try to protect them as best you can, but stay out of my way." Cassidy's body became rigid as she thought on what she could do to the unsuspecting imposter. She knew that the girl standing before her was playing her new family for fools, and that she needed to be dealt with. But she wondered what Jessica would think if it were discovered that she acted out against a member of the coven. Brittany seemed to notice Cassidy's malice towards her and drew in closer to test her resolve. After a second or two of the standoff, the coven was called to attention by Gabriella. Brittany scoffed and walked past her, shoving into her nemesis' shoulder as hard as possible before leaving. She took her time walking back towards the other girls, doing her best to calm herself down by breathing deeply. She wondered why Lydia would allow a fox of a person to enter the chicken coop, and found herself questioning the validity of the woman leading them. The older woman had seemed so knowledgeable up to that point, but with Brittany's induction, she wondered if Lydia had their best interest at heart. She made her way to the main room and found a seat near the path to the foyer, doing her best to avoid Brittany, who was situated beside their leader. Jessica was on the opposite end of the room from Cassidy, and the other girls filled the space sporadically. When they were all present, Lydia began their meeting. "I know you all are aware by now that I was responsible for telling Heather to cause a scene at the rally. I didn't specify that she should use a gun to scatter the crowd, but it was effective in its own way. Because we were so successful, I'd like for us to thank Heather for her dedication to the coven." "Thank you, sister." Brittany made sure she was the first to speak. "Thanks, sis." Tara was the next one to chime in. "Thank you, sister," Jessica acknowledged, "even though we nearly were trampled and arrested. I mean, come on, mother. That was reckless, and we all know it. Cassidy nearly—" Lydia shot a look at Jessica that Cassidy recognized from the first meeting, the same show of dominance that the older woman displayed when Jessica tried to defend her before. She was breathing heavier than normal, her anger growing with every second she looked on at their mother's commanding face. Just like before, Jessica silenced herself and folded her arms as she leaned back against the wall behind her. "Cassidy," Lydia called her without looking. "Come here, please." Cassidy looked around the room before moving, her thoughts locked on the last time she was commanded by Lydia to stand before her. There was something that was different than the last time, however, a part of her that was not willing to yield to whatever treatment she was going to be subjected to. She obeyed, walking at her own pace up to the beautiful woman. When she was standing directly in front of her, Cassidy stood still and waited for whatever punishment she was going to receive because of Jessica's outburst. "Look at you," Lydia began. "It didn't take more than a month for you to become more confident. A part of me wonders if it's because of the spirit you managed to contact. They're like that, you know. Confident." Just as Brittany had said, it happened quick. A sudden sound vibrated her eardrums that pulsed from a portable speaker in Brittany's hand, the noise sending her body into a frenzy as her vision blurred into a near-blinding redness. She released a yell that shook the other girls, her breathing becoming shallow as her muscles tensed while staring at their leader. A sudden compulsion made her want to rip the woman's throat out. But somehow, as she managed to control her breathing, she caught herself before delivering the blow. She let out a yell as she looked at the arm that was poised to end their mother's life. "No," she fought. "I'm in control." "Are you?" Lydia raised an eyebrow. The stress from holding back the demon was beginning to be too much for her to manage. She could hear the other girls shouting and trying to intervene, the effort being stopped by Brittany. The bodyguard had positioned herself perfectly between the scene and the other girls, her presence terrifying all but Jessica. The stronger girl stepped into Brittany's face as if ready to strike, both of them unwilling to yield to the other. "Get out of my way." Jessica's voice was sharp. "Make me." Brittany returned a menacing grin. Before their confrontation could spiral out of control, Cassidy commanded them both with great effort. "Stop!" It was becoming easier for her to speak. "I'm in control now." Cassidy stared blankly at Lydia as she calmed herself to the point of breathing regularly, her body still rigid from the effects of the projected noise. Lydia flashed her a nod as she removed her hand from near her leader's throat. As Cassidy returned her hands to her side, Brittany stopped playing the sound as Lydia began to clap. "Good," she said while barely moving. "I took the time to review the footage of that day you savagely beat your friend nearly to death. I know that you were thinking that the entity you managed to contact had entered you after the burning, but it was with you the entire time, my dear." Cassidy lowered her gaze at the sudden revelation. A part of her knew, but she didn't want to acknowledge it, the thought making her realize just how much of a freak she really was. Jessica shoved Brittany out of the way, made her way to Cassidy's side, and placed her arm around her to comfort the shaking girl. "Why are you putting her through this torture, Lydia?" Jessica shot back. "This coven is supposed to be a place where we grow in our power. What is all of this? Why are you constantly trying to hurt us? Having Heather go behind everyone's back. You've been inviting violence into our sisterhood, and I'm tired of it. We trusted you with our vulnerabilities, and it seems like you're exploiting us for your sick entertainment." "You saw it yourself, sweetheart." Lydia motioned to Cassidy. "I am helping you all grow in your power. When this girl came to us, she was on her knees, wanting to die. Now look at her, a proper spiritualist, able to command the spirits to do her bidding. It's hard to accept the things we don't understand, But that's why I'm here, daughter. To help you see clearly. The room grew quiet. All of the girls thrust it into their minds as Lydia continued to minister to them. The methods that I employed could be seen as extreme, but the results are evident. Jessica, you remember how it was for you in the beginning, the way how your family discarded you for their selfish career chasing. Tara, how your dad disowned you because of your desires was nothing short of abuse. Oh, sweet Penny, how many times have your parents tried to keep you from overdosing? You're better now because we found out you were being called by your grandmother. She turned to Cassidy. Cassidy is the exact same as you. Her story is one of depression and misery. Her mind trapped on the pain of the past. Somewhere along the way, she managed to gain a power, and she needs our help to grow in the way you all have. Jessica looked puzzled at the woman's speech, doing her best to put together the mess that was the late afternoon discussion. She looked to the other girls, each of them still searching within themselves the same way before looking at the one in her arms. Cassidy had calmed down and had seemed to be nearly as normal as she had been before the meeting. She let go of her and took one more look around the room before looking at Lydia. She had finally seemed to understand what Lydia was saying and felt defeated by the woman's logic. I'm standing in the way of my own growth, Jessica confessed. That's it, Jessica. Lydia nodded in approval. Don't worry. We're going to take the final steps to ensure that you grow in the same way. The late afternoon turned into early evening as the world began to grow dark. All of the girls casted throughout the mansion. They were instructed by Lydia to prepare themselves for a group ritual, and Cassidy was unsure of what that entailed. She was stuck with Gabriella. The soft-spoken witch was different than she had initially assumed. They didn't talk much as they focused on dressing themselves in the black robes Lydia had brought with her, but that didn't stop Gabriella from addressing her as she finished. Cassidy, did you need any help with the back zipper? Her calming voice made Cassidy forget about the strong musk perfume she wore. It's almost time. I think I need you. She accepted the assistance. Once her back was zipped and she was giving a final once-over by Gabriella, the two of them made their way towards the living room. Before they got to where they were going, however, her curiosity got the better of her. Of all the coven members that she had come to know, there was one that seemed to keep herself away from her the longest, that being the conservative-looking girl from Landon County. The remote place was as distant as the other cities were close, needing a longer car ride than any other to reach the border. And she wondered what life was like in the more rural area. You must really care about the coven to come from so far away. Cassidy looked at her as they continued down the hallway. I guess that we haven't really had the chance to talk since your joining. Gabriella kept her focus forward. I managed to work out a deal with the school when I transferred. In exchange for staying with Lydia, I get to enroll. You stay with Mother? Cassidy was thrown for a loop. Wait, are you two? Gabriella slowed a little as she looked at the expression Cassidy was making. She noticed how Gabriella had green eyes opposed to Lydia's piercing blue ones. The possibility of yet another familial bond she didn't know about, making her imagination run wild. Just how many members of the coven were related, or had ties to prominent people? It had seemed as though Gabriella read her mind, as just before they reached the living room, she stopped her. Not at all. Gabriella's smile was intoxicating. I was homeless just before the acquisition of the school. It's different in Landon County when you don't have anywhere to go. You can just live in the woods. I got arrested a few times for living in abandoned shacks and tents. Just as I was about to go to juvie for stealing, I was bailed out by a woman from Southern Cuts. It was weird because as soon as I was released, I was contacted by Lydia and placed in her care. Since then, I've been with her in Pinewood, further south, like you're going to North Carolina. I'm sorry. Cassidy didn't know what to say. I mean, to hear about your struggle. What struggle? Another smile gave Cassidy a shock. From where I'm sitting, I've won the lottery. When the girls entered the front room, they were met by a surprising sight. All of the other girls were dressed in the same way, their robes matching their mood. Since the last sermon from Lydia, all of them felt an unease settle within their minds. For however long the coven had existed, they were the fruit the older woman was growing, and they didn't know to what end. Even the way they carried their conversations in the moment were hesitant, each of them doing their best to put on airs to little effect. They were uncertain as to what lay before them, and Cassidy assumed the worst of their trials were yet to come. Prepare yourselves, sisters. Brittany's hard voice grabbed them from near the kitchen. Mother is ready. Follow me. The girls obeyed and followed Brittany as she led them to the back of the mansion and outside. Jessica was the last witch to leave, following behind Cassidy, and decided to pull the unsuspecting girl to the side before exiting the home. Cass, wait a second. Jessica had a concerned look about her. Something doesn't feel right. What do you mean? Cassidy said as she grew worried at Jessica's serious tone. Lydia said that this is for you. Isn't this what you want? Before Jessica could answer, the two were approached by Gabriella, the girl presenting herself with a calm that exhumed aggression. Stay close to us, sisters. Gabriella looked at Jessica. We're about to invoke forces that are beyond our understanding. Keep your minds focused on what you want to manifest and let go of your attachments. After the warning, the girls were led, with the other witches, to the stables where Lydia had set up an altar. As they piled into the space, they were instructed to split into two lines and walk around the spray-painted circle on the ground. Tara and Penelope were placed at the front of the two lines and made to burn sage while leading their respective line until the seventh encircling. On the last time around, each of the girls were made to stand at specific spots and await further instruction. Cassidy looked at her fellow witches and then to Lydia, who was standing off on the side with her attention on something the girls couldn't see. Jessica, Lydia called without removing her focus. Lead us in our evocation. Jessica prepared to begin, but before she could, Lydia cut her off. Jessica, focus on the energy within you. You've done so much for your sisters and your community, but you aren't free yet. Your attachments to everything around you has kept you down, but tonight you will be loosed. Jessica did as she was told and led the girls as she had done many times before. Everyone engaged in the intoxicating bout of profession by following along with the chants and hand gestures. Cassidy found herself swaying with her sister's words with no hesitation, her body accustomed to what she was at one time adverse to. She kept up with the offering to the universe until she noticed that they were a sister short. Once the evocation was complete and the girls returned to their poised stature around the circle, they witnessed Brittany enter the space with none other than Goldilocks, leading the horse by the reins into the center of the circle. Jessica released a gasp as she made a move to approach the two, but Lydia stopped her. "Stand still, Jessica." The woman's harsh tone caused everyone to recoil. "This horse represents all that has been keeping you from growing in your power. It represents the arrogant wealth your family has blinded you with, and it must be given up so that you can focus on what is more important." "No," Jessica hesitated. "I'm not doing this. This has gone on for too long, Lydia. This is too much." Brittany managed to lead Goldilocks into the center of the circle by this time. The other girls looked at each other as Lydia's focus reached them. "You see, my daughters?" Lydia walked around the circle with an item covered in velvet. "Material wealth can keep us from truly understanding our purpose, our greatest failure coming at the hands of our own selfish desires. Jessica, it isn't your fault. You've been born into a family that uses its influence to affect the people around them in a negative way. Like I told you before you joined us, you have the power to free others and lead them to truth. But you first have to be freed from the influence of man." Lydia stopped at Cassidy, the space between them filled with the scent of vanilla bean. Without further stalling, Lydia presented the blade to her from behind and waited for it to be taken. Cassidy could taste the copper-like tinge from the adrenaline pumping through her as she looked at the now uncovered dagger laying on the velvet covering. It may have been the silence of the others that compelled her to do so, but before she could refuse, she took the dagger into her hands and looked at the horse. "Cassidy!" Jessica seemed as though her heart was being ripped from her chest. "Cassidy, please don't." "Your sister is hurting, Cassidy." Lydia's voice was like a close whisper. "It's time to set her free." She wanted to protest, but she couldn't. Her throat caught on the look of desperation on Jessica's face. The girl was tearful and panting with a panic that she related with. She knew that there was no way that she was going to do it. It was madness to think that she would kill the one creature that allowed for her and Jessica to bond. She placed her gaze on the blade and let her mind search for a way to get the horse out of the room and a way to deal with Brittany and Lydia. She stepped into the circle. Jessica was right earlier in saying that Lydia was the problem, the only issues with them coming whenever the aged witch placed herself into their affairs. It was her that had shown the greatest aggression towards her since the beginning. For her to demand obedience in that moment was the most foolish decision she assumed would come from an adult. She patted the horse's face. There was only one thing to do in that moment. She was going to discard the blade and get Jessica to remove the two sources of poison from their home. She was going to tell her that she was going to stay with her from then on and take care of her. She felt that there was no other answer than to remain at her sister's side, even if they had to deal with the other witches, even if they had to run away together and live off the land like Gabriella did, even if... No! She had ran the blade through Goldilocks' throat. The horse bucked against the attack with its fleeting might, but Cassidy managed to continue, managing to slash through the tendons with each stab. Blood spilled within the circle and covered her in warmth as the horse collapsed and kicked wildly on the ground. She didn't stop, even as Jessica screamed and was held back by Brittany. She continued to rip and tear through the horse until its head was nearly removed. The odd thing about the entire ordeal to her wasn't the fact that she was committing such a violent act. Rather, it was that she wasn't being controlled. She wanted to do it. Brittany let go of Jessica and left as the traumatized girl fell to her knees, her whimpering being enough to disarm Cassidy. She took a step towards the defeated girl and tried to touch her, but she was met with a look that assured her that the two would never be friends again. That part of her didn't care, however. That same part that nearly killed Amber allowed for her to defeat those cops and then to kill Jessica's prize horse. She turned and faced Lydia, who was prepared to leave behind Brittany. Mother, Cassidy managed to force the horse's blood from around her mouth. What have I done? Your job, Lydia said as she left Cassidy to her misery. South. The Pinewood High School Incident. Chapter 9. She felt dizzy, the farmland around her spinning with each step she took towards the mansion. She didn't have much on her mind as she stepped into the silent home and walked up to the fridge, her focus solely on the carton of juice she remembered from the morning. After drinking the rest of the liquid from the carton, she discarded the carton on the floor and continued through the home, her thoughts unable to center on any particular thing. When she walked past the mirror, Cassidy witnessed just how horrific she appeared, her entire body covered in the horse's dry blood. Oh, yeah, she continued to stare at herself. She began to cackle at her ridiculous appearance, unsure as to why she was doing so. She drew closer to the sight and waited to see if she could hear the demon say anything in response. When she didn't get a reaction out of it, she prepared to walk herself to the bedroom to take a shower and get some sleep. The effort being stopped by a sudden ring of the doorbell. She didn't think much of the act, her body reacting by walking to the door to open it. One of the girls must have forgotten something, she thought as she approached the door, beams from flashlights piercing through the glass panels as she drew close. She turned the handle and opened the door to an unsuspecting sight. A couple of police officers standing in the way of their squad cars parked on the roundabout. The overwhelming light made Cassidy cover her eyes as she heard one of the officers gasp. It had seemed as though they were asking something, but she couldn't focus clearly, the one-sided conversation coming across as a muffled mess of words. After one of the officers lowered their flashlight from her face, she was able to gain a bit of her focus and noticed that the one furthest from her was a woman, and the other was a man that was only a little taller. You to say something. The male officer's words began to reach her. I have reason to suspect that a crime has been committed. She's okay now, Cassidy's voice was low. "She's not held down anymore." "Who are you talking about, sweetheart?" The female officer took a few steps and was in range to grab her. "Is there someone else in the home?" There was an uncomfortable pause as the three of them waited for something to occur. As if not wanting to disappoint them, Cassidy suddenly launched herself at the male officer, grabbing him and tossing him into the female officer. The female officer shouted something over her radio as Cassidy began to thrash at the male officer. She noticed that she was drawing blood from him and was content on the sustained beating, completely ignoring the other officer as the screaming woman aimed a weapon at her. As Cassidy was prepared to kill, a sudden sound cracked the cold fall night air that was followed by a loud crackling sound. Cassidy's body froze in place, her body not responding to the inputs being performed by the demon. Her body felt like it was being constricted by the night itself, her chest unable to expand the way she wanted it to for a breath. She fell to the ground and stayed that way until the crackling stopped, the male officer regaining his footing while retrieving some handcuffs from his belt. As he approached her to conduct the arrest, Cassidy sprang back to life and tried to sprint towards the female officer, but was dropped to the ground again by the crackling that was coming from the same source, a taser in the woman's hands. Cassidy felt tired as the male officer finished arresting her, a couple of the other girls coming to see the scene by this time. Tara was shouting at the officers while Heather was trying to pull Cassidy away. While she was being escorted to the squad car, Cassidy could see that the female officer had managed to keep them at bay by drawing her pistol and kept it trained on them. When she was tossed into the back of the squad car, she witnessed her sisters being forced at gunpoint to the ground and felt her hatred building. She kicked and screamed against the interior of the car, managing to damage the reinforced protective glass that isolated her. Within a few more minutes, she was being transported to somewhere, several more squad cars pulling into the farmhouse, as the one she was in pulled away into the night. Her head was hurting, the thoughts she wanted to have finally reaching the forefront. What was she going to do about school on Monday? Was Arthur running away from home again? She needed to make dinner for Mom. Of course, that was the reason she called earlier. She had to call Amber to see what they were going to prep for the week. It was late. She was going to need to get some sleep if she was going to make it to the bus on time. She kicked and screamed against the interior of the police car as it made its way through Charleston Heights, the uncontrolled rage she felt bursting through the meager restraint she used to uphold. She was an entirely different person then, made evident by how forceful she was kicking the doors. The officers, despite her efforts, maintained a forward view of the passing city while talking amongst themselves. This continued until they were further away from the edge of Charleston, the car finally making its way to its destination, the police precinct. Getting her out of the police car was another effort, the veracity of Cassidy's thrashing causing them to call for restraints. She was tased again and strapped into a carrier, to which she was wheeled into the precinct without further dramatics. After being processed and made to wait for a few minutes, her temper began to cool. She took stock of her surroundings. The white-walled interior of the place was painful to look at after the dark car ride. The sound of metal doors slamming shut was accompanied by the jarring buzz of the alarm for said doors. With a sigh, she had managed to return her breathing to a less than enraged panting, soon following her thoughts. Am I going to jail? An hour passed as she sat in silence. the slight hum of the failing fluorescent bulbs above her serving as a constant alarm clock. She was tired, but not enough to ignore the constant noises of the uncomfortable place. There were other people near her, some of them talking to themselves, and others fighting against the restraints the way she assumed she was. The worst part in all of the commotion stirring around her was that she needed to pee, a thought that made her begin to worry more than being arrested. Not too long after, 2 female officers arrived to check on her and, upon seeing her in a calmer state, decided to engage with her. "Cassidy Learman?" One of the officers spoke plainly. She nodded her head. "You've been fighting since you came in. It looks like you're calmer now, so we're trying to see if you'll cooperate and let us get you out of that chair." She nodded again. She was released from the restraints of the chair and handcuffed without fuss, cooperating with them as best she could in order to get what she wanted. After asking for the restroom break and receiving it, she was returned to a waiting room that housed another group of degenerates, most of them remaining to themselves. She was made to sit in a corner to herself and remained there for at least another hour. Time didn't work the way it normally did in that place. Every second seemed to pass like minutes as detainees and officers alike danced around her in blurs of obscurity. Sometime later, she was untethered from the bench she was sitting in and brought into a small room with a table and 2 chairs. She remained shackled, but was left alone, the sudden silence making her anxiety begin to mount. "Are you there?" she asked the corner of the room. "I know you are. We're in a bit of a mess now. I'm sure Mom is being called. Can we talk?" She didn't get a response. "I realize now that I haven't asked you who you are or what you are. You already know who I am. You're in my head after all. We've been using each other without the other's consent. I didn't think that I would need you, but it's been twice now. Please, don't let me sit here alone. I don't want to be alone right now." She waited for a response. "Ander. What kind of name is that?" I can't talk. Cassidy didn't seem like a good name for me, I thought. I would have gone with something like Jessica. Do you think she's okay? The silence spoke to her. Yeah, I don't think it matters anymore. She's free now, right? Her dad can't use her anymore like mine did. She can be her own woman now, like Lydia said. I guess I wish that I could have been there beside her. Tears began to well as she listened. They'll most likely send me to jail. I'm okay with that, I guess. I'll have you with me at least. My only friend in the end was a demon. How about that? As Cassidy's resolve began to set, the door to the room suddenly opened to present a tall, dark-skinned man who seemed to be in his late 40s. His dark skin contrasted with the light blue button-up shirt he wore, the fabric of which doing a good job of accenting the toned physique hidden beneath. The air of authority he commanded as he paced to the other side of the table took her attention from her conversation. He tossed a manila folder onto the table before sitting, the act of which making her narrow her gaze. Hello? I'm Detective Harvey with the Charleston Heights Police Department. Are you okay? Did you need anything? No. Cassidy didn't look at him. Okay. First off, I want to let you know that you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in court. You have the right to an attorney, if you want one. If you can't afford one, one will be. Why am I here? She interrupted. Well, we received a call from an upset father who witnessed a bloody girl walking through the halls of his home with his daughter nowhere to be seen. We responded and found that bloody girl at the front door, and she instantly attacked two of my officers. Can you explain to me what happened? Cassidy felt herself frown as she thought on how stupid she was to have forgotten about Brett and the existence of cameras. She began to breathe heavier as she ridiculed herself, the act causing Harvey to lean toward the distressed girl. It's okay, you can take your time, he said as he waited for the spell to pass. We've spoken to the other girls that were at the farm. They had some things that they said about you that we wanted to confirm. What did they say? Cassidy could barely contain herself. Well, for starters, that you were the one who stabbed the horse to death. Is that right? Yeah. Cassidy caught herself. I did what Mother said do. Jessica was in trouble and... Mother? What's your mother's name? Harvey maintained his posture. Cassidy stopped talking. She thought about what she was about to do and wondered what the other girls would think of her if she suddenly gave away everything pertaining to the coven to a man that had the power to end their sisterhood. She looked away from the detective and remained that way for a moment until he decided to speak for her. Do you know the name Lydia Hadley? I don't want to talk anymore. Cassidy impulsively spoke. Okay, that's fine, Harvey said as he repositioned himself to face the manila folder on the table and opened it to a few items that he began to sift through. The truth is we have enough on you and the others to start pressing charges. Most of you are still underage, at least for a few months, but trial will go on longer than that. You'll be looking at some decent jail time if we don't get these reports ironed out. We have you on animal cruelty, 4 counts of bodily harm to an officer, incitement of violence. What? She broke her silence. The shooting downtown, Cassidy. Harvey toyed with her. You were there with the main suspect. Cameras, remember? Cassidy's eyes grew wide as she reflected on everything that occurred over the weekend. They were reckless and didn't pay attention to how they acted. Every action they committed being televised and monitored. There was no escaping it. The litany of crimes she had committed were proven and stacked against her without no means of defense. She was alone. The same loneliness she had thought she was free from had managed to creep back into her life to destroy everything she fought so hard to keep. Cassidy shivered as the detective spewed her history at her. Although her attention was on the man, she felt as though her mind was dancing around the room, looking for any possible means of escape. Maybe she could use the Ander demon to kill him and make a run for it. Maybe she could plead insanity and get off with more medications. As her thinking began to spiral, Detective Harvey pulled her focus by sliding a picture of a battered girl towards her. You remember Amber Long, right? Harvey felt confident. Although she didn't come forward to press any charges, her sister did. You have a mean streak, Cassidy. What was going through your head when you did that to your friend? She didn't want to respond, her throat tightening at the memory of Amber's delicate face meeting her brutish fists. The image of the blonde's swollen features made her whimper as she leaned in to take in the horrific image. Deep purple swells accentuated her cheekbones and connected to her reddish, swollen eyes. A mark was left across the bridge of her nose that she assumed would be there for the rest of her life. When she had her fill of the photo, she leaned back in her seat and examined the floor. Cassidy, I'm not going to tell you what to do, but as things sit right now, you're going to have a pretty big legal battle to fight soon. Harvey retrieved the photo and replaced it in the folder. From what I understand of the situation, you and your sisterhood are going to end up in court and then in jail. I can help you if you want, but you're going to have to cooperate with my investigation, okay? This was it. The moment that would define what her future would look like. She wondered what the others were saying, if they would be able to get her out of their situation and return to the school without incident. It didn't seem that way, the thought sending Cassidy's gaze to the man that held all the cards. She wondered what Lydia would tell her to say, the older woman's dominating aura remaining true throughout the toughest of situations. Just then, as if the woman's confidence reached her, Cassidy remembered who she was and let her power protect her. Honestly, that's the best you can do? The Anderdemon's voice echoed in her mind as though it were her own. Fear tactics against a frail girl. Didn't you know that I was on medications? You caught me at a bad time, Mr. Detective. That's what you're going with? Harvey folded his arms. You beat a girl and several officers, aided in the terrorizing of a peaceful gathering, and killed an actual horse. That's not something you can get out of, Cassidy, no matter what plea you try to make. Cassidy sat up straight. Maybe you're right, she said with words made her own. Maybe we're all getting into some form of trouble. Or maybe not. I guess we'll have to see what happens. Whatever does happen, though, Detective Harvey, I'll keep fighting against it. I see what the problem is, and I'll handle it. One way or another. That sounds like a threat, Cassidy. Harvey frowned as he released his arms and placed them on his knees. Maybe you should stop talking before you get in even more trouble. No, Detective. Cassidy felt as confident as her coven leader. Maybe you should pay more attention. As soon as she said this, as if on cue, the door to the interrogation room swung open, giving way to a well-built woman with dark hair, outlining a determined look that fixed on Cassidy's captor. She gave the aura of a businesswoman with a grudge, the personification of everything Lydia wished she could be. With her was a supposed underling carrying a briefcase that Cassidy had assumed held something that concerned her situation housed within. The two of them took no time announcing who they were. The underling was named Kyle, and his boss was named Elizabeth Shaw, a Cadwell Company representative. This girl is now represented by the legal team of Cadwell Company. The woman held no reserves. Her bail has been posted and she is to be released immediately. Okay, hold on. Harvey wanted to stall. I need a few more minutes to... No, thank you. Elizabeth motioned to the door. With the air of a defeated house cat, another person entered the room, dressed in the attire of one that was supposed to be in charge of the police force. Harvey's eyes widened as she saw the police chief gaze at the girl across from him before meeting the detective's confused expression. Looking at the gathered troupe of actors was confusing to her at first, but Cassidy held her tongue as the adults conducted their business with each other. "Uncuff her, detective," the police chief said in a lowered voice. "This girl has committed multiple crimes against my officers, sir." Harvey stood at the insult. "We have every right to—" "Uncuff her, detective," the police chief said, this time with conviction. "Let her go, Harvey, or it's your badge." His confusion met with something Cassidy was familiar with, as the well-built man was made to submit to the command of the weaker one. He finished releasing Cassidy of the metal cuffs and stepped away as she began to nurse the sore ring around her wrists. As if to reintroduce herself, the Elizabeth woman walked over to Cassidy and placed her hand on her shoulder, the pure scent of lilac giving her the impression that the woman was thorough in her use of power. With one last look at the man who had begun piecing everything together, she saw the confirmation of the man's intent processing through his mind. "I'll be seeing you soon, Miss Learman." "No, you won't," Elizabeth answered for her. "Come with me, dear." It didn't take long to finish Cassidy's release from custody, her new benefactor managing the entire process for her as if it were a common practice. She had questions, but she gathered that the time would present itself, her only job being to remain quiet until she was clear of the situation. That time had finally made itself evident as, when she was finally walking out of the front door of the station, she was brought to the door of a black SUV with dark tinted windows. Elizabeth leaned casually against the front of the vehicle, near the engine, while Kyle went to the trunk for something. "Cassidy, can you come here?" Elizabeth called to her, in a way that she assumed was supposed to be a question. "I need to see your hand." Without thinking, Cassidy presented herself for the woman's quick inspection, and was soon made aware of how great a mistake that was. She was grabbed at the back of her neck by Kyle and forced against the hood of the SUV, the quiet man holding her arm outstretched towards his boss. Elizabeth was tossed some form of kit from Kyle, which she opened to reveal a syringe and a few vials. One contained a plunger with a clear liquid inside. Cassidy, although struggling with all of her might, could only watch in horror as Elizabeth drew closer with the needle aimed at her forearm. "Keep still, or I'll miss." The shrewd woman smiled at the threat. The threat was effective as Cassidy eased her resistance a little. She watched as the corporate bully stole her blood as quickly as one would steal a breath. When she had filled 3 vials with her blood, the woman inserted the plunger and placed her thumb on the back of it. With a steady press, the syringe emptied into her body and made the injection site instantly grow cold. The needle was retracted, and Cassidy was let go just as quickly as she was grabbed, her 2 assailants moving on as if nothing happened. "Oh, what did you do to me?" The cold sensation in Cassidy's arm began to grow warmer as it spread throughout her system. Elizabeth ignored her questioning, instead choosing to motion to Kyle, who presented Cassidy with a legal document with a few label stickers poking out. The man produced a pen and waited for her to take it, but when she didn't, he glanced over at Elizabeth, who narrowed her gaze on the defiant girl. "Sign on the first, third, and last page." Elizabeth continued to treat her like an expenditure. "I can't feel it anymore," Cassidy tried. "What did you do to me?" "Sign, or we send you back in." The response from her benefactor was so sharp, she did as she was commanded without further restraint. When the formality was out of the way, Elizabeth motioned to Kyle, and the man collected the articles before disappearing into the SUV without saying anything. A chemical tinge tainted Cassidy's senses as she began to feel unstable on her feet. Her curiosity, however, managed to stabilize her enough to witness the woman who had abruptly entered her life prepare to leave the scene just as quickly. "Wait!" Cassidy was prepared to grab her if necessary. "I'm talking to you." "You have a lot of questions." Even as she was stopped, Elizabeth maintained dominance. "You can talk to your mother on Monday. This should be the last you see of me. Do us both a favor and focus on school." With that, Elizabeth Shaw returned to the obscurity of the world, leaving the insecure teen to her loneliness. Cassidy gave into the pressure from the injection and fell back onto the cement curb. She didn't know what to focus on. The chemical that the calculated woman shot into her veins had reached her brain and made everything around her feel uncertain. She tried to talk to the Ander demon, but it wasn't there. The sudden silence of her mind making her feel as though she were losing touch with the reality she had come to accept. She didn't know for how long she was sitting there, but as her mind began to refocus on the real world, she noticed that her brother's truck was approaching from the entrance of the police precinct. At first, she felt relieved that he was there, but then she remembered how they had last left things between them and began feeling a little anxious. He stopped the truck a few feet short of where she was, but he didn't get out to help her, allowing her to prepare for the litany of questions she was sure were going to be hurled at her. The ride from Charleston Heights towards her wooded home was surprisingly quiet for Cassidy, her focused brother maintaining his gaze on the sunrise-laden interstate as if trying to avoid any possible interaction with her. The way he kept himself reserved was infuriating, his stoic jawlines making him look more of an authoritarian figure than she gave notice to before. She could tell that he had just woken up, but she didn't care. His silence was irritating, and she wanted to get the ridicule over with. It took her nearly until they entered Pinewood for her to finally speak up. "It wasn't my fault, Arthur." She folded her arms. Arthur repositioned himself without looking at her. "I only did what Miss Hadley told me." "Mom doesn't want you back at home," he finally said. "She's been worried about you, but you caused her a lot of stress over the last few weeks. Cass, I don't know what's gotten into you, but you have to make this right." She frowned at him, hoping that he would notice the attempt at shifting blame. Her conversation with her mother from before was short, but effective in letting the unstable woman know her boundaries. As she continued to boast in her mind, Arthur spoke yet again. "What is going on, Cassidy?" His question struck her as condescending. "You're acting like you're the victim of some atrocious crime, but we've only been trying to help you. What more do we have to do or say to get you to see that?" "Didn't ask," Cassidy muttered. "What?" Arthur said more than asked. "I didn't ask for your help." She let it boil over. "I didn't want you trying to comfort me or be near me. I hated him, Arthur. I hated Dad for all of his prying and random lessons about life that coincidentally always occurred whenever I wanted to do something he deemed sinful. I told you both that, but you've been acting just like him lately. I can't stand being treated like I'm the problem just because I want to be left alone or try something new. I'm not your well-to-do, God's going to fix it Christian. I'm angry and hurting. I hate, and I want to hate. Let me feel what I want to feel." Arthur glanced at her as she released her stance on the issue and furrowed his eyebrows. She didn't know what he was thinking, but she knew that, whatever it was in conflict with what she wanted to manifest. Of all the lessons she was taught by Lydia, the main one was her ability to use her intentions to convene with desired spirits, those energies being what Penelope called guides. She closed her eyes and focused on what she wanted and waited for a confirmation of her effort. "I'll be leaving next week for Landon." Arthur snapped her out of her daydream. "I've been selected to help with a nutrient leak from one of Southern Cuss's vats, and I won't be back until November." "What is that supposed to mean?" Cassidy stared at him. "I'm not going to be able to take care of Mom on my own, Arthur. I have school and—" "First Lady Martha's agreed to help Mom, so she'll be coming over to help her with her medicines, and—" Cassidy felt something in her core, but it was faint, the mere mention of that woman reminding her of the previous encounter. It may have been whatever she was given by her rescuers at the precinct, but she couldn't get as upset over such things like before. She looked out of the window as they passed the border of Bankwood into Pinewood and wondered how she would get out of staying home, her mind resting on the farm and Goldilocks' corpse. "She's also going to make sure that you are taking yours." Cassidy felt her stomach compress as he said that. "No." "You don't have a choice now, Cassidy." Arthur kept his focus on the road. "I talked with Dr. Randall. He was wondering why you haven't been renewing your prescriptions. This is your last chance, Cassidy. After everything they told me happened over the weekend and how you look now, you're going to have to check in with the doctor every week moving forward." He took a glance at his sister and, when their eyes met, gasped unexpectedly. Staring back at him were cold and focused eyes that didn't seem to have the warmth in them that he had known in his youth. She was a different person entirely. Nothing that he assumed would be noticed by the others, but to him she was unnerving and foreign. There were no other words said between them the remainder of the ride, but Cassidy could see that Arthur got the point. She wasn't going to be controlled, least of all by him, and she was prepared to express that point to any one of his lackeys, including their mother. When they got home, Cassidy didn't say anything to either her brother or mother, the older woman trying to get her attention as she rushed to her room. She slammed her bedroom door on them and locked it before throwing whatever she could find indiscriminately around her. She screamed and allowed the shame she felt for killing Jessica's trust in her to escape with the threats from her brother and judgment from her mother. There was no escaping what she'd done, and her future began to look murky at best. It took the rest of the day for her to realize she was on the floor, holding herself in a fetal position, away from the window. The sun was going down outside, but she couldn't find the energy to keep it from doing so. When the room was finally dark, she allowed her body to move, getting up from her defenseless state to her feet to attempt a bathroom break. When she reached the door to her room, she touched the door handle and wondered if she would see any of them in the hallway. She managed to gather herself for the possible encounter and opened the door to an empty hallway, the only sound she could hear coming from her soft steps onto the carpet. When she was in the bathroom, Cassidy went to the mirror and examined herself. She was still covered in blood. The dried mess was chipping off her skin, at this point, as if she were a molting reptile. She took off her clothes and turned on the shower to clean it as best she could, the effort taking longer thanks to the same issue she discovered after the rally. As she scrubbed herself, she watched the red stream of blood flow away from her body towards the drain and wondered why she didn't feel anything. When she was done, she got out, dried herself, and looked in the mirror again, this time checking out how much she had changed physically. Where at first she was pudgy and slightly hunched, she was a bit more toned and upright, the confirmation of which coming with her flexing her muscles. She still couldn't feel the demon, her thoughts wandering to the possibility of finally being rid of it. Even with something so blatant as freedom from control presenting itself to her, she failed to manage the connections in her mind to gratitude, instead feeling isolated and vulnerable. What's happening to me? She allowed herself to drift off in thought as she opened her drawer to retrieve her medicine. Is it because of this? Or the coven? Or... She placed the medicine on the counter and stared deeply into her eyes. Something was missing from her, and she didn't like the idea. Whatever Elizabeth had done to her, feeling permanent. She knew that Jessica was never going to hear her out, and Amber was most likely plotting some form of revenge against her. She had no one left that she felt could understand her, but she wasn't ready to move on. Where are you? She stated more than asked. I get pumped full of some random meds and you disappear? She waited for a response, but no answer came. It was odd for it to remain so quiet until provoked, the only response coming when she was under duress. As she thought on that point, a dark thought found its way to her, and she reacted without reason. With a closed fist, she punched the mirror with enough force to splinter it into shards. She took one of the larger ones without hesitation and placed the sharp point at the top of her forearm. I asked you a question, demon. She stared blankly at the multiple reflections staring back at her from the broken glass. Where are you? Still, she didn't receive an answer. She didn't hear anyone in the house stirring at the sudden act either. So she decided to take it a step further and stabbed herself. She felt the initial puncture, but the pain was muted beyond what she had felt when she had did it before. As if it were instinct, she began to pull downward towards her wrist and stopped herself. Why aren't you stopping me? She maintained eye contact with her broken reflection. I'll do it. I'll end it right now. Her heart raced with each passing second. The memories she tried so hard to stow away for a year, clawing their way from the depths of her psyche in the same way the Ander demon did before it was silenced. She wondered if this was going to be it. A final confrontation in the night, alone and miserable, with no aid from anyone. Like the evening she lost her father, she wanted the shame and guilt to end. Her life coming to an end by her own will. She wanted for him to be wrong in saying that her life wasn't her own, and with the glass poised to prove it, she was ready to commit to her hypothesis. As she began to trace her vein with the glass, the sound of a singing cat in her bedroom managed to snap her out of her trance. She fought to control her breathing as she placed the glass on the counter and turned her attention to the radiant sound, the musings of which made the current stillness of the home feel out of sorts. When she made it to the room, She looked at the source of the noise resting on her bed and waited a moment before checking to see who it was calling. She didn't want to talk to any of the coven at the moment. Even Lydia was on her ignore list, but she was curious nonetheless. She reached for the phone and flipped it over to see the name of the caller, her heart racing as the revelation hit her a second after. Cassidy shivered at the thought of speaking to her victim and wanted to flee back into the bathroom to finish what she had started. She didn't have much time to make a decision on the call and fought desperately against herself to ignore it entirely. Before the call could drop, however, she answered the phone and held her tongue. At first, there was no sound, the caller seeming to be nothing but a figment imagined by her hysteria. But within another few seconds, a light voice delivered a blow to her gut. Cass? Amber didn't sound as lively as Cassidy remembered. Can we meet? South. The Pinewood High School Incident. Chapter 10. The night air chilled her bones as she paced down the two-lane street leading away from her home. She was on a mission to get to the main road and meet with her rideshare, the effort being done without the knowledge of her mother or brother. As she passed house after Forrest Layton house, she wondered what kind of life the inhabitants lived, lamenting on how damaged her life was in comparison to the perceived serenity of theirs. From her conversations with Dr. Randall, she gathered that such thoughts were unstable and often led to downward spirals. But after all that had happened to her recently, she found herself not caring what she thought, especially because of the quieted demon. The one good thing that came from her long walk was the memories of cascading through the woods as a child, a carefree journey past tall trees and soft earth. She loved the smell of the seasons reflected in that place most of all, the denotation of autumn by the caramelization of fallen leaves under a cooling sun. It was magical, and hers, a true daughter of the forest, prancing and gathering to her heart's content. That was in the past, however, and as she passed yet another group of homes that were newly developed, her lamentation grew. The times were changing, and the past was a memory, but at least she was given that consolation. It took almost 30 minutes for her to reach the intersection of the main road, her objective being completed as she stood near the elementary school on the corner and waited to be picked up. The world was still at night in Pinewood, mostly because there was nothing to do except go to the 24-hour store she was about to travel to. Sitting alone in the dark made her feel like she were in a different time altogether, away from the pressures of society and given to her own efforts. She knew that she wasn't able to reach such a place anymore. It was taken from her well before she was born, after all. But she liked the idea that there was a way for her to regain control somehow. It didn't take much longer for her to wait, as when she had managed to catch her breath and sit on the nearby curb, a dark-colored SUV pulled up, and her phone gave the familiar confirmation notification. After greeting her driver, Cassidy maintained silence as she was transported further into Pinewood towards the business district. The ride began quietly enough, with her spending the majority of it surfing through posts on Hunter. But the silence was interrupted when the driver decided to probe into her attempt at independence. Late night shopping trip, yeah? The slightly overweight man stretched his short dark hair as he spoke. Yeah, just picking up a few things. Cassidy didn't feel like confiding in the stranger. I get it, the man smiled. My wife loves getting me to go shopping whenever she feels like it. I wonder if it's just a woman thing or something. The attempt at conversation that was aimed at her seemed to fail as Cassidy returned her attention to her phone, the man returning his attention to the road with another awkward rub of his scalp. The ride remained quiet again for a good stint of time until they reached the district. Cassidy got off her phone and looked out of the window to witness the bright streetlights and business signs. With an uncontrolled sigh, she decided to get one last piece of advice from an outside party. "Can I ask you something?" Cassidy held herself tightly. If you felt as though you were not in control of your life, like everything you wanted was placed outside of your grasp by someone else, what would you do to get back control? Strong question at 1 a.m. The man took his time before answering. If I felt that way, I would first ask myself what there was I was able to control. I believe that there are plenty of things we can change, but the world has a funny way of making us feel like we can't. Yeah, that's what I would say. Find what you can control and focus on using that to grow, in whatever way you can use it. Is it really that simple? She looked at his reflection in the rearview mirror. What if you don't have anything? What if you're alone and there's nothing for you to hold on to? She could sense her question was weighty, but she didn't know how else to phrase it. It was how she felt after all, like a pit had opened up and swallowed everything she could use to fix her situation. What else was there to use to protect herself when all that she had grown used to was abruptly taken away? Amber was sure to express how much she hated her, and rightly so, but even though she were about to be shunned by her ex-best friend, she had to see it through. She only wished that it didn't feel so painful. In that case, the man said before she could completely forget that she had asked him a question, I'd say that, with a deep breath and the ability to think, anything can be achieved, as long as you don't give up. A moment later, and they were pulling up to the store. Cadmart was a large warehouse that catered to everyone's needs, but there was something that she needed that she wasn't sure it could provide. As she stepped out of the SUV, Cassidy thanked the man before watching him pull off into the night, a part of her wanting to have him take her back home. She turned to face the entrance of the building and, while pulling on her jacket, she walked inside. The brightness of the interior space was overwhelming and made her shield her eyes as they adjusted. The large expanse of products helped to lower her guard as she walked further within, her attention almost being taken away from the real reason she was there. It took another moment of walking past the food section for her phone to ring, and when she answered it, she slowed her walking and spun around to see if she could spot her. Hey, yeah, I'm over by the food, Cassidy said while searching for her. Yeah, of course you are. She smiled at Amber's attempt at humor. Cassidy waited for her accuser by the frozen foods for a moment, and, as if she were prey to the hunt, Amber appeared behind her, startling her with a shove of her shoulder. Cassidy held her hand to her mouth as she gazed at her blonde companion. Her face wasn't as damaged as it was in the photo Detective Harvey showed her. The bruising had gone down, and the color of her skin was restored around her eyes. She was as beautiful as she was before the assault, the only exception being the cut on her nose that, although faint, was still noticeable. Cassidy instinctively reached out to examine her face, but Amber jolted back as she did so, causing her to begin to cry. Amber, She tried to explain herself. I'm an idiot. I'm so sorry I did this. Cass, it wasn't your fault. Amber looked on as Cassidy began to wipe her face with her sleeve. How can you say that, Amber? Her voice was muffled as she spoke through her attempts at clearing her face of tears. It was me. I was the one on top of you. It was my fist that did this to you. I'm so sorry, Amber. I didn't know what happened or why I did it, but I'm sorry. I know, Cassidy. Amber walked up to Cassidy and wrapped her arms around her, the act shocking her more than her best friend's acceptance of what had happened. Cassidy returned the gesture and poured what remained of her love into the one she almost destroyed. After nearly a minute of this, Amber pulled away abruptly and waited for Cassidy to calm herself. Looking on at her, Amber released a smile as she watched Cassidy reduce her sobbing to light sniffles. All of this over a little fight? I wonder what you would do if I died. Amber folded her arms. Don't joke like that, Amber. Cassidy met her stance, and the two looked as though they were facing off against each other for a second time. I called you because I found out something important, Cass. Amber released her reserved stance and grabbed Cassidy by the arm to lead her further into the warehouse. We have to talk about the school. The girls made their way to the far end of the store near the baby stuff, Cassidy commenting on her desires to be a mother one day, much to Amber's dissatisfaction. When they were nearing the end of the section, they stopped near the cribs to talk further. As she spoke, Cassidy looked at how confident Amber was and felt a sense of severity she hadn't experienced from her before. There was something going on that she felt neither of them were prepared for. It wasn't by accident that we had our fight. Amber confirmed what Cassidy had felt since the incident occurred. I did some digging into our illustrious benefactor and found out some messed up stuff. For starters, do you know what compound I-347 is? Compound what? Cassidy felt herself losing touch. It's an additive in the products we're consuming. Amber looked around the store as if to see if anyone was watching them. It's an agent that the military was experimenting with years ago, before we were born. Cassidy raised her eyebrow at the sudden statement. It wasn't as though she didn't believe Amber, but she wondered what they were really discussing. It wasn't like her best friend to spew conspiracy theories or conservative rhetoric, the sudden sharing of which made her take a second look at the girl before her. Although there was a lot happening at the school with the new meat product and ads everywhere, she felt that it was all par for the course when it came to corporate intervention. She prepared to say something to that effect, but Amber beat her to it. I know how it might sound, but it gets worse. Amber held her ground. Thanks to Kimberly, I was able to dig into some files from the late 80s pertaining to the purchase of Gwendolyn Meats by the Cadwell Corporation. Guess what happened to that company? It was renamed to Southern Cuts. So what? Cassidy was losing patience. Amber, we need to talk about what happened between us. I hurt you, and you want to talk about some business merger? No, Cass. Amber looked more serious than she ever had. This has everything to do with what had happened to us. Gwendolyn Meats was a government test bed for food additives during the Cold War. They were testing long-term preservation solutions in case we were forced underground due to nuclear war. They made their way from the baby owl towards the shoes, and Amber began to look at some of them as she spoke. Cassidy didn't know what to say or think as she listened to the blonde girl spew the information she gathered. While listening, Cassidy felt as though she were being brought into something she didn't want to be a part of. The dumping of information from the thin girl making her want to stop paying attention. But she continued nonetheless. Kimberly was right. Southern Cuts has been using the school as a test bed for something, Amber said as she refocused on Cassidy. Compound I-347 is an isotope that is used for communication relay from external stimulation. In other words, it's used to communicate information from outside a host body to the inside. But Cassidy felt a chill finger her spine. I mean, okay, it's just information, right? That's no different from anything else pertaining to a doctor's visit, right? It would be if that was all to it. Amber found a nearby bench and sat down. The algae, Cass. Remember what you said about it being bacteria? Gwendolyn Meats had managed to create the isotope to try and control the progression of the bacteria spoiling its product, but the application was a fail. When Cadwell bought the company, however, they managed to find an alternative use for it. Cassidy felt her knees weaken at what she assumed Amber was going to say. The thought had crossed her mind before, but she wanted it to not be real. The products she was comfortable consuming being used to control her actions. As she fell into her thoughts, Cassidy audibly gasped as she remembered everything that had occurred over the last month. The weird sounds from the intercom at school, the coven and the protests, and the Ander demon. With Amber's attention set towards her, Cassidy did what she felt was right and took control of what she could. Amber. Cassidy's concerned expression made Amber return the sentiment. I joined them, the witches. I'm a witch of the Blackroot Coven. It sounded ridiculous coming out of her mouth, but she didn't know how else to say it. She waited for a response without looking at Amber, her thoughts flying to how she would plead for Amber to forgive her and not end their friendship. There was a silence between them a moment as Cassidy assumed Amber had to process the shock of what was said. As she returned her gaze to her best friend, however, she saw that Amber had a grin on her face. Yeah, Cass, I knew. Amber might as well have laughed. It was obvious when you snuck that pamphlet back into your bag that you were interested in Jessica Schumer's offer. What is it like to be a witch? You have the overweight thing going, but your nose isn't big enough. You knew? Cassidy's shock at Amber's attention to detail was greater than everything else she had said up to that point. Amber, I thought you would have hated me for joining. Why would I hate you, Cass? We're best friends, right? Cassidy felt herself beginning to cry again. Amber saw this and got up from her seat to comfort her yet again. The relieved girl taking the extra effort to squeeze her best friend tighter than she ever had. When the moment was over, Cassidy let her go, but still held her hands. The desire to remain linked, filling Cassidy with feelings she didn't want to let go of. They stared at each other again as Cassidy took in the acceptance from her best friend, allowing an unspoken bond to form between them. Amber, I'm so glad that you know now. Cassidy felt like flying. I've learned so much from Mother and the other sisters. We've been through a lot over the last few weeks, but they hadn't abandoned me or made me feel like I was wrong in any way. I found my power with them. I'm a spiritualist, Amber. I can communicate and use spirits to help me accomplish my goals and... Whoa, slow down, Sister Learman. Amber's jest made Cassidy remember how obsessed she was. Maybe we can ease me into the crazy instead of spilling at the first meeting. Sorry, Amber. Cassidy lowered her gaze. I'm just really happy you know now. Right. Amber walked away from her to lead them away from the aisle. Come on, I want to check out the electronics. The girls made their way along the back of the store to where the electronics were and stopped periodically at the computers. Amber lamented at the price on a few models, while Cassidy looked at some game consoles and wished that she had the money to buy one. When they had their fill of window shopping for the moment, Amber continued her spill on what she discovered during their time apart. Cassidy listened intently as they remained in the aisle of the electronics section looking at movies. When we were told that the school was going to be including products from Southern Cuts, we all assumed that it was just the meat that was going to be different. Cassidy, it's in everything. The drinks, chips, vegetables. It might even be in the water. That's insane. Cassidy began to think of every time she put anything in her mouth at school. That would mean that it's too late to avoid it, right? Yeah, but there's more to it. Amber examined a fantasy movie called Tales from Corridell, The Undead Wars. The isotope has a half-life of a few weeks, so give it about a month and it's out of a person's system. What I want to know is what can be done in that time period to someone who is under its influence. Cassidy looked stunned as she reminisced on what she had done over that time. She told Amber about the bonfire and her communication with the Ander demon. She told her about how she was being controlled by it and that she attacked police officers as well, all while explaining how it felt good while it was happening. Amber listened to her in a way that she felt was not judgmental. When she finished her explanation to her best friend, she remembered why she loved her the way that she did. Amber was the only person she could share what was on her mind with and not have her try to fix what was wrong. I see. Amber put the film back and began walking away from the electronics section. Cassidy followed behind her, and the two made their way towards the hardware section, where Amber decided to stop near the tools. She did this frequently when they did their shopping together. The blonde seeming to take a liking to various tools and gadgets Cassidy was okay with ignoring. Before they could continue their conversation, they were met on the aisle by another late-night wanderer. It was a man. His broad shoulders and taller stature made Cassidy feel intimidated a little as he excused himself while moving past them to examine the hammers. Come on, Cass. Amber grabbed her by the arm again and walked her away from the intruder towards the household goods. We have to be careful now. I don't know what might happen to us, but do me a favor and keep a lookout for anyone you might not trust. There's more going on in the lower shores than we know. When they were safe within the confines of the bedding aisle, Amber felt safe enough to let go of Cassidy's arm and began to examine some pillows. Cassidy did the same, but as she checked the firmness of one, her phone rang, the caller being Arthur. Amber must have sensed how Cassidy was feeling and snatched her phone from her to answer. Before Cassidy could stop her, the phone was answered and Arthur's angry voice could be heard piercing the quiet store. Chill out, baby. She's with me right now. Amber's careless use of words was another reason why Cassidy felt safe sharing with her. The bathroom? Well, I wouldn't get too mad at her, babe. Remember when you bruised her arm because you couldn't control your liquor? Okay, don't wait up. She'll be back soon. With that, Amber hung up the phone and gave it back to Cassidy, who was still trying to rationalize in her head how she was going to appease her angered brother. Amber gave Cassidy a wink and went back to checking out a sheet set Cassidy assumed she wanted to buy. She placed the phone back into her pocket and stayed by Amber's side the rest of the way through the section until they reached the kitchen appliances. As Amber went to check out some toasters, Cassidy took a minute to look at her and fantasize about a world where they were living together, doing some late-night shopping for things they knew they needed for their 2-bedroom apartment in the nearby area. I want us to promise each other, okay? Amber pulled her away from her dream. There's a lot going on, like I said. I know I don't like to say it, but I'm scared, Cass. What happened with us might only be the beginning of something we both aren't yet ready to handle. I know that we might have more coming around the corner, but I'd like for us to handle it together from now on, okay? Cassidy looked Amber in the eyes and felt, for the first time, a responsibility to the one that was with her from the beginning. Cassidy held out her hands to see if Amber would trust her enough to meet her the rest of the way. Without hesitation, Amber reached with her hands to meet the larger girl, and the two held each other's hands in solidarity. It wasn't spoken, but Cassidy knew that Amber was on the same page as her. When they released their grip on each other, Amber decided to state an addendum to their contract. Next time, tell me everything up front, okay? Her beautiful eyes dropped whatever resistance Cassidy may have had. Even the stuff with the coven, okay? I might not understand it, but you're my best friend. No. You're my sister now, okay? The joy Cassidy felt built in her chest to the point of it almost being painful, her rounded face casting a smile at the girl she knew she would do anything for. They spent the rest of their trip holding hands as they made their way throughout the store, stopping near the toys to play with foam swords and looking at board games. When they had their fill of the place, they decided to prepare to leave, Cassidy wanting to buy them something sweet, some chocolate chip cookies, before doing so. Amber called them a rideshare to get back home, to which Cassidy decided to ask what she'd been holding back from doing since they became friends. Hey, Amber, how do you always have the money for rideshare? What Ada doesn't know won't hurt her, right? Amber's smug expression made Cassidy smirk slightly. That's wrong. Your mother might get the wrong impression of me if she finds out. She doesn't care about anything I do, Cass. The blonde girl looked into the distance as she checked her phone. Even before Dad died, she was so focused on Kimmy's success that she forgot she bought another kid. Whenever Amber brought up her adoption, Cassidy knew that she was needing to vent about something going on in the house. She was prepared to probe further as they entered the line to buy their things, but Amber's phone beat her to the punch. A text chimed in that took all of her newfound sister's attention away from the conversation. There was a kind of look that she gave after reading it that made Cassidy raise an eyebrow. A quick look of concern that was uncharacteristic of her companion. Is everything okay? Cassidy asked as she began to pay at one of the self-scan registers. Yeah, hold on a minute, okay? Amber began to walk towards the exit of the store. I think the ride is here. Hurry up and pay for the cookies. I'll wave them down. With that, Amber left Cassidy to pay for the food, and she did so rather easily. As she collected her items and walked away from the registers, She thought on what the man had said to her before she entered the store and smiled. It was unlike her to feel so warm, but she loved it. Contrast with the rest of the weekend, she was glad to be getting some concession for the effort. She reached the exit doors and decided to take one last look at the place before leaving to cement the reconciliation. "It's going to get better from here on," she affirmed as she focused on leaving. "I'm still breathing after all." When she exited the store, Cassidy looked around to find Amber, but didn't see her at first, her gaze finally falling to a white van parked a good distance to her right. As she further focused on the vehicle, she saw who she was looking for talking with the passenger. She took a step towards the scene and felt a sudden chill, not from the cold night, but from something inside of her. It didn't take much longer for her to realize why she was feeling the way she was, as, before she could take another step, the door to the van flew open, and a familiar frame jumped out. Amber? Cassidy couldn't fully grasp what was playing out before her. When she saw the large man grab Amber, Cassidy felt her heart kick the inside of her chest as the girl who called her sister began to struggle against the attacker. She kicked and screamed into the night as the man flung her wildly towards the gaping maw of the van. She wanted to do something, but her legs felt weak. Before she could give up and collapse, however, another feeling gripped her from the depths, something she thought she lost. "Amber!" She roared into the night as she allowed herself to feel the rage she thought was locked up by Elizabeth. Cassidy lunged at the scene of the attempted kidnapping with as much might as she could muster, feeling the strain against her muscles as she did so. She focused on her breathing while approaching, but she couldn't think of anything else to do, her only goal being to free Amber from the man somehow. She was within a foot of the struggle, and thanks to Amber's continued effort, neither of them were inside of the van yet. Cassidy took the opportunity to take advantage and grab the man by the neck before attempting to tackle him to the ground. "Let go of her!" Cassidy shouted as she continued to fight against the man. "Cassidy, watch out!" Amber tried to say it in time. She heard the impact to her head before feeling it, a sharp pain finally registering after a flash of white briefly blinded her vision. She wanted to continue fighting, but her body couldn't gather any further commands from her brain, the attack from behind being successful in knocking her unconscious briefly. Cassidy rolled around on the ground and tried to regain control of her body as she heard Amber continue to scream. Her best friend was finally given the same treatment from the one that hit her, and she fell deathly silent. "No, Amber!" Cassidy managed to get to her knees as the sliding door slammed shut. "Please, help me. Someone help!" It was no use. The door to the driver's side opened and shut against the growing silence of the night, as Cassidy had finally managed to get to her feet, the world spinning her around in an attempt to keep her from pursuing the kidnappers. She managed to stabilize herself on a nearby traffic guard and did her best to focus on the van that had started its engine up. At the sound of the engine preparing to depart, Cassidy closed her eyes and tried to call on it one last time. "Come on." She tried to talk to it the same way she did at the police precinct. "Come on, demon. I need you." The van began to pull off. Cassidy forced the frigid air around her into her lungs as she dashed towards the van in an attempt to do something for her captured sister. As she drew near to the vehicle, however, she wasn't fast enough as, Before she could reach the handle to the sliding door, the van pulled off with screeching tires. She continued to run behind the van as fast as her legs would carry her, but it was all in vain. The van reaching the end of the parking lot and speeding onto the main road. Cassidy fell to her knees and screamed into the night, the horror of witnessing her sister being taken, making her forget her sense of self.